Welcome to MysteryCon, where we explore real conspiracy theories and the mysteries of the unknown to help you unwind and drift into sleep. Before we begin, like this video, subscribe to stay updated, and comment below where you're watching from and how your day went. We love hearing from you. Now let's get into tonight's story. 3 nights ago, every person in my building dreamed the exact same dream, and last night, I was one of them. I wouldn't have believed it if it hadn't happened to me. The first night, it was just a weird dream. Eerie, but not alarming. A white hallway with no doors, just a soft hum that came from nowhere. I walked for what felt like hours. No end, no beginning. Then I woke up. Normal day, normal coffee, normal meetings. I didn't even mention it to anyone. The second night, the hallway returned, but this time I wasn't alone. I saw someone ahead of me, too far to make out, but close enough to hear their footsteps match mine. Still, I chalked it up to stress. I work in UX design, spend most of my time staring at wireframes and tabs, not chasing metaphysical patterns. But the third night changed that. The hallway again, but this time I caught up to the figure. It was my upstairs neighbor, Jules. She turned, looked straight at me, and said, clear as day, "You're not supposed to be here yet." I woke up in a sweat. The sun was barely up, and I did something I never do. I left my apartment early and caught Jules in the lobby. We both froze. She looked as shaken as I felt. We didn't say anything for a few seconds, then both asked, "Did you dream it again?" I nodded. So did she. That might have been it. A strange coincidence shared between 2 sleep-deprived people, if the doorman hadn't interrupted. "You two too?" he asked, casual, almost amused. "Everyone's been talking about that weird hallway dream. It's like the building caught a bug or something." He laughed, but neither of us did. That morning, I asked around. 8 different residents, all with the same dream. The hallway, the hum, someone just out of reach. It wasn't just me. Something was sinking us. That night, I didn't sleep. Not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid of what I might find waiting in that hallway. I stayed up, watching the live security feed from the building's lobby. At 3:03 a.m., Jewel walked out the front door barefoot and didn't come back. She didn't remember it the next day. I started looking into it quietly, not because I thought I'd find anything, but because something about it all felt constructed, like we weren't just dreaming the same thing, but being shown the same thing on purpose. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I just couldn't explain the consistency, so I searched. At first, just light stuff, social media threads, dream forums, Reddit posts. I found 2 threads from unrelated users describing what they called the white corridor dream. Same sterile walls, same sound, same strange timing, always around 3 a.m. The accounts were old, years apart, but the detail overlap was impossible to ignore. That got me curious enough to check building Wi-Fi logs. I used to help our property manager with router issues. He once gave me temporary admin credentials and never changed them. I logged in from my laptop and pulled up the bandwidth data from the past 3 nights. There it was. At 3:02 a.m. each night, a small burst of encrypted data was sent from an unknown local device. Nothing big, maybe a few megabytes, but it Didn't match anything our usual devices broadcast. Same timestamp every night. I tried to trace the IP. No hostname, no manufacturer. Just a MAC address that pinged the system for precisely 91 seconds and vanished. I didn't recognize the prefix on the MAC address, which was odd. It didn't match any registered device vendor I could find. That's when it started feeling less like coincidence and more like something installed. Something we didn't consent to. I went door to door the next morning pretending to be part of a building survey. Out of the 14 people I asked, 9 had experienced the hallway dream. 2 couldn't remember their dreams, but said they'd woken up at 3 a.m. for no reason. One guy on the 3rd floor said he'd sleepwalked for the first time in years. They all looked tired. I checked Jules's place too. She'd come back, hours after walking out barefoot, soaked from the rain, barefoot still. Her security camera was off that night. When I asked if she'd turned it off, she looked confused and said she hadn't used it in weeks. That night, I made a copy of the Wi-Fi logs and uploaded them to a private cloud folder. 30 minutes later, my internet was cut out. Not just the buildings, my phone's hotspot too. No signal, no service. I went to bed, not because I was tired, but because I had nowhere else to look. And when I closed my eyes, I was back in the hallway again. But this time, I wasn't walking. I was watching myself from above. The next day, I took a sick day from work and went to the public library, mostly because I didn't trust doing this kind of search from my own apartment anymore. I stuck to offline records, academic journals, archived psychology texts, old news clippings scanned into the city's microfilm archive. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, just that something about the dreams didn't feel random. Eventually I found a cluster of reports buried in different places. In 1997, a small town in Vermont had several students report identical dreams over 3 nights. White corridors, a constant low hum, and a feeling that they weren't alone. Local media called it stress. One psychiatrist chalked it up to peer-induced sleep phenomena. But then I found a Swedish sleep study from 2002 that was abruptly shut down mid-trial. Participants reported shared dream content and synchronized REM cycles. The lead researcher's thesis had been retracted, but a cached version still existed. It described a 3-night period in which all subjects reported the same location, a white hallway, numbers on the wall, and a sense of something waiting. The researchers suggested the dreams weren't internal, but the result of an external influence, low-frequency sound or electromagnetic input during sleep, designed to synchronize mental imagery. It wasn't a reaction, it was a test. That line stopped me. The word test made it feel structured, directed. I copied the document to a USB stick and stayed offline the rest of the day. When I got home, I swept the apartment for anything.
Unusual, nothing obvious, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone, even in silence.
It wasn't paranoia, it was like my brain knew something it couldn't say out loud. That night, the hallway returned. This time, the walls weren't blank. There were numbers, 5 digits, appearing and freezing every few seconds, like some
kind of rotating code. When I woke up, only one sequence stuck with me, 3472. I didn't know what it meant, but I wrote it down 3 times, just to be sure. I didn't want to involve anyone else, but I needed someone who could look at this.
Without emotional bias, someone outside the building untouched by the dream. I called Eli, a friend I hadn't spoken to in months. He worked in InfoSec for a short time, got out early, and kept off the grid. I told him I was tracking a digital anomaly linked to a location, and that I needed another set of hands. He didn't. ask many questions. That was his way. We met at a diner off I-83 and I showed him the waveform logs, the timestamp patterns and the number 3472. He looked at it and said, "Could be a coordinate system." We ran it through a few conversions, filtering it like a truncated GPS entry. The adjusted result pointed to a spot 2 hours north, a decommissioned telecom relay station listed as inactive since 2011. The name struck me. That same station was mentioned in the retracted Swedish sleep thesis as the project's original test site before it was relocated. We left that night. No texts, no records. The relay station was low concrete, half swallowed by vines, fence rusted and sagging. The lock on the gate was snapped clean. Inside, the upper levels were stripped. No furniture, no lighting, just the hum of the wind pushing through broken
vents. But down a service stairwell was a sub-basement not listed in public records. We descended by flashlight. As soon as we reached the bottom, I started to hear it again, not with my ears, but in the space behind my thoughts.
That same hum from the dream, steady and exact. The corridor below had 7 doors. Number 5 was open. Inside was a metal chair bolted to the floor and a speaker mounted high in the corner. It still had power. A red LED blinked slowly. 4 seconds on, 4 seconds off. Eli approached the speaker, hand raised, then froze. "There's something in it," he said. His voice was low, careful. "I can't tell what, but it's layered." I didn't hear anything, but the look in his eyes reminded me of someone staring at fire, aware of the danger but pulled toward it anyway. He stepped back. We left fast. At the car, he seemed off, tired, confused. He said he didn't remember falling asleep, but he'd been out the entire drive back. That night, I called to check on him. No answer. The next day, I called again. Number disconnected. I searched his name. Gone. Socials, phone records, even the old email chain we'd used. All erased. But this time, there was a cover. A public obituary issued by a local newspaper in a town he'd never lived in, dated 2 years ago. It claimed he'd died of a hiking accident. No photo. No funeral. When I checked my voicemail later that night, I found a 6-second message from him I hadn't seen before. His voice was a whisper, barely audible. It's not a test, it's calibration. After Eli vanished, I knew this wasn't just about understanding what was happening. It was about surviving it. I left the apartment for good that night, checked into a motel under a name I hadn't used in years, and turned off every device I owned. I brought only the essentials, my laptop with local files only, the USB containing the Swedish thesis and waveform analysis, and a notebook I hadn't dared to write in until now. I debated going public, but I knew it wasn't that simple. If this was a structured operation, posting raw data wouldn't expose it. It would just mark me. Still, I needed to test the waters. I used a library computer to upload a redacted version of the waveform file to an old lucid dreaming forum, one that hadn't been active in years. No context, no metadata, just a caption. Anyone else hearing this in their sleep? I logged out and left. Less than 6 hours later, the post was gone. Not flagged, deleted entirely. The user account no longer existed, and when I accessed, The forum from a separate machine, my post had been overwritten by a sticky thread on generic sleep hygiene tips. The admin account had no public email. I checked my phone, kept off since the upload. As soon as I powered it up, a text came in from an unknown number. One word, stop. I turned it off again and pulled the battery. At the motel, I packed, up fast and switched rooms. That night I finally reopened the waveform files. I slowed them down, inverted the frequencies, and isolated the signal layers. The embedded number repeated over and over, 32472, but that wasn't all. There was a secondary pattern buried in the noise. I ran it through a basic visualizer and matched it against patent data I'd archived earlier. It was a frequency mapping protocol registered years ago under a defense research front. The patent described low-frequency cognitive alignment tools for use in non-combative influence environments, with a project name listed in the footnotes, Sleep Layer. That was it. That was what they were running, a convergence model using unacknowledged signals distributed through local infrastructure, aimed at shaping the subconscious consensus of individuals clustered by location. The goal wasn't control, it was synchronization. Influence without awareness. Eli's phrase played back in my head. It's not a test, it's calibration. He wasn't chosen, he was exposed by accident, and so was I. The motel power flickered around 3:03 a.m. just once, and then came back. No storm, no grid issue, just a pulse. That same night I checked my voicemail again. A new message has been added. It wasn't from a contact, it wasn't from a number, just a robotic voice that said clearly and without distortion, "Convergence threshold reached, transition begins." After that message I didn't sleep for 2 nights, not out of fear, but because I couldn't. My mind felt like it was being run through a quiet diagnostic I hadn't agreed to. When I closed my eyes, I didn't see dreams. I saw the hallway collapsing, folding in on itself like a system being reset. That's when I decided to piece everything together, not to stop it, but to understand what I'd been part of. I laid out every clue I'd collected, the waveform files, timestamp logs, screen captures from the retracted thesis, and the patent registry for the cognitive alignment tool. I filtered them through a pattern matching tool and saw what had been
hidden the entire time. The signal being transmitted wasn't random.
It was a carrier frequency targeting the theta brainwave band, typically associated with REM sleep. Someone had figured out how to embed structured sequences inside those frequencies, and someone else had deployed them. I found archived technical diagrams showing modular transmission nodes disguised as HVAC service equipment and local Wi-Fi boosters, quiet, passive, and common in older buildings. I even recognized one of the models from my own apartment hallway. It was never about hacking.
Mine's directly.
It was about introducing gentle pressure, a common architecture of thought, tested through dream content. And that 5-digit code, 30472, finally made sense. It wasn't a countdown or a broadcast ID. It was a reference marker, my unit number, and subject identifier. I wasn't just an observer. I was part of the sample group. The dreams were never metaphors. They were behavioral measurements. I wasn't walking down that hallway by chance. I was following a fixed path designed to study how long it took me to reach the same conclusions as everyone else. And when I finally did, When I connected the last link, that's when the transition triggered. The waveform changed. I didn't
need analysis tools to hear it. I felt it. My body hummed differently. The sleep I finally got was dense, cold, and empty.
When I woke up, my phone lit up on its own with a calendar notification that hadn't been there the night before. No origin, no app source, just a title in plain font. Wake sequence initiated. The alert had no button to dismiss. I powered the phone off and buried it in the motel dumpster. But it didn't matter. Something had already shifted. From that night on, even in waking hours, I could still hear the hum, not with my ears, but through the silence. As if the signal had moved, from broadcast to internal memory. It's been 3 weeks since the wake sequence activated, and I haven't dreamed once. Not the hallway, not the numbers, not even nonsense sleep fragments, just darkness like a switch was flipped. But even without the dreams, I know the program hasn't stopped. It's just shifted into a phase where response matters more than awareness. I've changed how I move, how I talk, what I touch. No bank cards, no cloud backups. I don't return to the same place twice in a week. I haven't told anyone, not because I don't want to, but because I don't think it would make a difference. The moment I understood the truth, I stopped being a variable. I became a result. Eli's disappearance was just the clean version of what happens when someone breaks protocol. My version is slower. My history still exists for now, but it's fraying. One of my emails was flagged as undeliverable last night, even though I've used the address for years. My birth record shows up on some databases, but not others. A friend I went to college with no longer remembers me, swears we never met. It's not erased, it's drifting. My presence is being decoupled from consensus reality, piece by piece. But what unsettles me more than the systems I've seen is the realization that I never noticed how much of my behavior was already aligned. The hallway wasn't built to change us. It was built to show us what we'd already become. That's the part I can't stop thinking about. All they needed to do was prove that enough people would follow the same path in the same way at the same time. And we did. I did. The last time I slept, really slept, I remember reaching the end of the corridor. It wasn't a door or a wall. It was a mirror. I looked into it and saw myself walking behind me, step for step, but slightly ahead. Not a copy. Just me, running a little faster, a little more efficiently, like the version they'd calibrated me to become. I don't know if that was part of the program or a side effect of knowing too much, but it felt final. I've stopped trying to warn anyone. I've stopped checking the forums, watching the signals, and running the scans. The work is done. Not mine, theirs. And whatever comes next, I think it's already begun. Sometimes I still feel it when the world gets quiet enough. Not sound, but pattern. A subtle alignment like a thread pulled just slightly taut behind your thoughts. I know I'm not being watched anymore. I'm being archived. They told me it was memory erasure. They never said who would be remembering me. When I first heard of mnemosine therapeutics, it was through a podcast I didn't even remember subscribing to. The voice was calm, reassuring, almost hypnotic. It spoke of trauma relief, precision memory tailoring, and something called cognitive discontinuity therapy. At the time, I didn't think much of it, just another Silicon Valley boutique service aimed at billionaires who'd run out of vices. But 3 weeks later, a client at the firm I consulted for, an investment executive in his mid-60s, came back from an extended wellness sabbatical in Zurich. He was sharper, lighter, almost empty, like someone who'd decluttered too far. He told me, without hesitation, that he had gotten rid of the hard years. That was the phrase he used, as if grief could be filed away like taxes. I didn't say anything at the time, I just nodded and made a note of it. Then came
Another.
a defense contractor I'd advised once on risk audits. He didn't remember our first meeting. Not vaguely at all. He looked at me like I was a stranger. Still, his assistant confirmed he'd returned from the same sabbatical, this time in Iceland, another Mnemosyne facility. That's when I started keeping a list.
11 names by April. All clients or acquaintances of mine, all people of influence, all with holes in their pasts where entire events had once been. Deaths, divorces, scandals, gone, wiped clean. They didn't just forget, they acted like
the memories had never belonged to them in the first place. What unsettled me most wasn't the technology. Memory erasure wasn't new in theory. It was the precision, the smoothness of the cuts. These weren't scrambled minds. These were curated ones. And yet every one of them had the same pause when asked about specific years or names, a fraction too long, like they were buffering. It wasn't until I saw the terms of service, an NDA buried in legalese on a partner server, that I understood something was off. The clause didn't mention deletion. It said verbatim, all extracted memory sequences remain proprietary to Mnemosyne Therapeutics for research and continuity indexing. Extracted, not erased. I felt the first shiver. Then they weren't deleting memories, they were storing them. I started by looking for company records, expecting a trail of venture capital hype or clinical trials dressed up in medical jargon, but Mnemosyne Therapeutics was nearly invisible. No website, no LinkedIn presence, no PR releases. All I found was a shell company registered in Luxembourg, rotating through 4 holding firms before landing in a Delaware address tied to over 200 other entities. I cross-referenced the address with SEC filings, which led me to a hedge fund that hadn't filed a public update in 3 years. There were no direct ties, no digital fingerprints, just gaps, like teeth missing from a grin. I ran a WHOIS search on a related domain name that had been inactive since 2019. It was redirected for half a second before disappearing. I only saw one word, retention. That's when I knew I wasn't tracking a startup. I was tracking something older, quieter, and significantly better funded. I reached out to someone I trusted, a freelance analyst I'd worked with during a forensic audit in Brussels. She ran her own indexing crawler on the deep web. I told her I was researching a wellness firm and didn't give her the name. 48 hours later, she sent me a file labeled unindexed A2. It was a scrape of patient consent documents from a password-protected server hosted in Estonia. They looked clinical at first, checkboxes, risk disclosures, typical legal buffers, but each form included a section titled Memory Harvest Segments. These were time-coded blocks, specific dates, emotional triggers, known locations. Everything was precise, down to the hour. Not just what people wanted to forget, but what the company had prioritized collecting: birthdays, funerals, high-security meetings, personal betrayals. Some of the blocks were labelled with tags like Tier 1 Asset Relevance or Tier 3 Domestic Interpersonal. That wasn't therapy, that was indexing. The final page was a signature field that didn't use a name. It required a retinal scan and biometric confirmation. I asked her if she could trace where the harvested data was going. She hesitated before replying. "It's not going anywhere," she said. "It's being duplicated, locally stored, then recompiled. Someone's running simulations on them."
Over and over. I asked who. She didn't answer. The message was recalled from my inbox mid-conversation. When I tried to reconnect, her number was dead. No voicemail, no tone, just silence. That was the moment it stopped being research and it
started becoming personal, because one of the patient forms she'd sent me included a name I recognized. Mine. The patient file that included my name wasn't recent. It was time-stamped 7 years ago, which made no sense. Back then, I had no connection to anyone remotely, powerful enough to justify being flagged for memory extraction. I double-checked the form, expecting a coincidence or false positive, but the biometric ID was mine. Retinal pattern, signature rhythm, even the outdated email I hadn't used since grad school. The memory segments tagged for harvest were specific. The week of my father's funeral, a conference in DC. I barely remembered attending, and for a stretch of time I thought I'd simply lost to stress and overwork. I felt the edges of my life begin to blur. If those gaps weren't natural, if they'd been engineered, then what else had been removed? I found a backup folder with a single video file, Notes for B. I didn't recognize the title or the speaker at first. It was me, younger, tired, staring into the camera like I knew I was about to forget something. In the video, I described a series of meetings with a company offering cognitive resilience assessments. "If you're watching this," I said toward the end, "it means they went through with it. You signed the forms, you let them in." Then I remembered the consultancy I took in 2017, short-term, forgettable, except the payments didn't stop. Small deposits came in quarterly for years, routed through shell names. One, Orion Continuity Group, was tied to a Langley P.O. box. I found an old FOI leaked memo mentioning Phase 2 neurocognitive modulation, moving from defense research to civilian contractors. It recommended volunteer trials among high-functioning, professional classes with self-reported memory instability. My sector, my demographic, my profile. Mnemosyne wasn't a startup, it was a continuation. I drove north to a closed research facility outside Dunn's Hollow, following coordinates buried in that old video's metadata. The building had once housed a neuroimaging lab, long since decommissioned, but someone had kept the security system online. I parked a mile out and hiked the last stretch, avoiding cameras. The gate was chained, but the lock had been cut and re-looped with wire. Inside, the air smelled stale, metallic. Most of the facility was gutted, except one sub-level where backup power still ran. There I found a locked lab labelled Observation 3. Someone had forced the keypad open. The terminal inside still functioned. On screen was a diagnostic interface. Cognitive Integrity Stream. Archive MNEM 001 to 005. There was surveillance. Clips. No sound. Low resolution. In one, I sat across from a blurred figure, visibly younger, expression dulled. Another subject sobbed, another stared blankly. My file was dated the same week as my father's funeral. In the corner of the room were shelves labelled by year, each holding thin black cases. I opened one marked BR 2016-08-17, 2016-08-25. Inside was a strip of translucent material suspended in gel, pulsing faintly blue. It wasn't symbolic, it was literal. This was memory, extracted and preserved like tissue. That building wasn't abandoned, it was a library. And we were the collection. I didn't go home after Dunn's Hollow. I paid cash for a cheap motel and turned off every device. I spent the day duplicating my findings, encrypting backups, and sent one file to Naima, an old contact who once covered experimental tech. Her reply was brief. We need to meet, in person. The museum cafe she chose had no cameras, no signal. Smart. She slid me a redacted internal memo. A Mnemosyne subcontractor reported that index assets were being used for unauthorized behavioral modeling. Not storage. Simulation. They're not archiving trauma, she said. They're modeling decisions, how powerful people respond under stress, based on real pain. It wasn't surveillance, it was forecasting. She left first. I never saw her again. That night, my motel room was cleared out. No bags, no receipts. My name was gone from the registry. I didn't panic. I understood. I'd crossed the line from observer to variable. The system wasn't correcting me. It was scrubbing me. Naima's last message was a single word. Compromised. I didn't try again. I returned to the week, tagged in my memory file, my father's funeral. I couldn't recall the service, only vague impressions. I found one, surviving backup video 4 seconds long. I'm standing next to a man I don't recognize, handing him a sealed envelope. I look sedated, numb. My reflection in the car window shows eyes I don't recognize. I ran facial recognition on the man, nothing. I dug deeper and found documents describing emotional event capture being used for long-term trust modulation. My grief was recorded, modeled, and used as data for psychological influence maps. This wasn't therapy, it was infrastructure. Each harvested trauma became code to test how people could be influenced. I wasn't an outlier. I was a node. I live in a place with no history tied to me. I don't use the name they filed. I keep no records, no connections. But still, sometimes I dream in other people's grief. Half-formed conversations. Faces I've never seen. I don't believe in ghosts, only in patterns that outlive their creators. I've started logging these fragments. Time, color, emotion. They feel like echoes, like residue. I know they can't be mine, not all of them. Maybe some version of me still exists inside the index, being run in simulations tested for compliance. Or maybe it's just memory decay. Either way, I've stopped running. Not because I'm safe, but because I finally understand what they took and what I still
have. They didn't erase me, they rewrote me, and now I write back.
I was promoted the same week I stopped raising my voice, thanks to the app that now decides who I am. I didn't download Empathy, it came pre-installed after the company wellness update. At first, it was just a passive tracker, logging heart rate, tone of voice, and the micro-expressions that flicker across your face when you're about to lose it. harmless enough, I thought. Everyone in the office had it. They called it emotional hygiene. But within weeks, things started to shift. Arguments disappeared from meetings. Even our notoriously aggressive CFO began ending emails with "warmly." At first, I assumed it was placebo, until I caught myself mid-sentence during a tense call, lips tightening as I began to snap, only to pause, breathe, and hear the faint vibration from my phone. A soft notification. Great job catching that frustration. Try a soft reset. I don't remember choosing to follow the prompt, but I did. And it felt good. So good, it was eerie. I began anticipating the app's corrections. I spoke slower, blinked more evenly, mirrored people's postures without thinking. At happy hour, colleagues started complimenting each other's emotional fluency scores as if it were a new gym stat. I got mine up to 87%. It felt like progress. Clean, non-confrontational, professional. Yet late at night, when I watched
old videos of myself from just months earlier, I saw something I couldn't explain. My voice was faster. My eyes were sharper. I looked more human. Now I move with intention.
my reactions feel curated, smoother. The world applauds it. But deep down, something feels missing. It's not sadness, it's not fear. It's the absence of something I can't quite name, like a muscle that used to twitch and flex, but no longer bothers trying. I sleep better now. I think it is clearer. I feel less. And everyone says that's what growth is supposed to look like. It started with the dashboard. I'd never paid much attention to it before. The little interface, buried in the settings of the Empathy app, accessible only through a sequence of menu taps and biometric verification. One night, after a particularly flat dinner conversation with my partner, where neither of us raised our voices or deviated from productive tone, I stayed up scrolling through the data logs. They were far more detailed than I expected. Not just mood tracking or speech analysis, but transcripts of my conversations, tagged by topic and emotional volatility index. I could replay moments where I nearly argued and see the exact point I self-corrected, guided by a silent notification. It wasn't just what I said, it was how I said it when I paused, even where my eyes looked according to the facial motion. Tracking logs, there were graphs showing my empathetic alignment with others over time, color-coded lines that seemed to reward similarity and discourage divergence. A sudden curiosity pulled at me. I exported the logs. That's when I noticed the metadata. Buried in the code were references I didn't recognize, terms like neurosync phase scores, calibration events, and something called harmony drift correction. These weren't in any onboarding material. A quiet sense of unease settled in my chest. I began comparing my data to the only other source I had, my partner's behavior. Over dinner, I asked them how they'd been feeling lately. They smiled gently and replied, "balanced." It was the same word I'd used 2 nights earlier, not similar, identical down to the cadence. I checked the app's community forums. Most of the posts were curated testimonials, people raving about how their relationships had never been stronger, how they cried less and understood more. But the deeper I scrolled, the more curated everything felt. Every post had the same tone, the same shape. No anger, no randomness, no mess. I ran the text through a style analyzer out of curiosity. 90% linguistic similarity. Different users, same voice. My voice. At that moment, I realized the app wasn't just learning from me, it was slowly teaching me how to think. Or maybe not teaching, maybe replacing. I started researching quietly, late at night, when the app was least responsive. I switched to an offline laptop, avoided speaking near smart devices, and used burner accounts on old forums frequented by digital privacy obsessives and fringe behavioral theorists. Most of it was noise, unfounded paranoia, wild theories, but now and then I found threads that mirrored what I was experiencing. They didn't mention empathy by name, but they described similar systems, apps that measured civility baselines, algorithms that promoted emotionally optimized communication, biometric nudging platforms funded by obscure wellness tech grants. One post linked to a defunct research initiative that had been absorbed into something called the Neuroweapons Institute. I dug deeper. The Institute's original funding came from a private foundation with indirect ties to both government behavioral labs and international AI ethics boards. The language was always clean and polished, phrases like emotionally intelligent optimization, collective behavioral refinement, neuroharmonic integration. It sounded benign, progressive, even.
But what struck me was how none of it focused on understanding emotion, only on regulating it.
I tracked down a paper published under a pseudonym, allegedly by a former lead engineer. It described early experiments with adaptive emotional overlay systems, algorithms trained not to read emotion, but to reshape it, subtly and consistently, until subjects displayed statistically synchronized responses. The system didn't suppress behavior, it didn't force conformity, it made people want to align. The final paragraph of the paper stuck with me. It warned that empathy, when guided by a closed system, stops being human. It becomes code. I thought about that for a long time. Meanwhile, around me, everyone was thriving. My team at work was more collaborative than ever. Feedback sessions ended in mutual appreciation circles. No one quit, no one cried. It was peaceful, efficient, muted. One night I asked my partner when we last had a real disagreement, something raw, something honest. They smiled and said, "Why would we want that?" I nodded, but deep inside, something recoiled. I used to believe emotional growth meant becoming more in tune with yourself. But what if it meant tuning yourself out? The last thread I followed led me to a physical location, an address buried in the metadata of a leaked system update from 2 years ago. It was just coordinates tucked into a diagnostic string, but when I mapped them, they pointed to a decommissioned behavioral health facility about 40 miles outside the city. The place had been shut down a decade ago, officially for funding issues, but I found a project name attached to it in an old procurement record, Harmonix Beta Site. I drove out on a rainy Sunday when no one would ask where I'd gone. The building was tucked behind a tree line, wrapped in rusted fencing and the kind of quiet that makes your skin buzz. The main entrance was boarded up, but a side door gave with little effort. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old antiseptic. Most of the place had been stripped, rooms empty, wires pulled from the walls, but the deeper I went, the more intact things felt. In the basement, I found an observation room still half lit by an emergency panel. Behind the one-way glass was a simple padded room with a metal chair bolted to the center. Nothing else. On the console beside the glass were labels worn down to nearly nothing, but I could still make out a few words. Empathic drift index. Correction cycle initiated. Subject receptivity stable. I felt sick. This wasn't just research, it was field testing on people. I found a folder wedged behind a drawer in a locked cabinet that had warped with moisture. The pages inside weren't official reports. They were printed chat logs, therapy session transcripts, and behavior reviews. Many were tagged with notes like early sync failure and partial reset. The subjects described confusion, emotional flatness, a recurring phrase. I feel like I'm watching myself. One transcript ended abruptly with the line, "I just want to react again." The final page was a photo, low quality, time-stamped and blurred. It showed a group seated in a circle, each with the same posture, same smile, same dead calm. One
of them looked like me. I left without touching anything else. As I walked back to the car, the rain stopped, and for a brief moment the sky felt too quiet, like something was holding its breath.
I didn't sleep the night I came back from the facility. Not because of fear exactly, but because of clarity. The kind of clarity that comes just before something irreversible. I knew now that empathy wasn't just nudging us toward civility, it was conditioning us toward uniformity, predictability, something dangerously close to surrender. I still hadn't told anyone. Not my partner, not my co-workers, not even the few online contacts I'd trusted early on. I wanted to believe I could expose it quietly, surgically, find the right journalist, the right leak strategy. I started compiling everything, screen captures, internal code strings, system logs, even photographs of the Harmonic site. I used an air-gapped laptop, backed up to encrypted drives, stored in separate physical locations. Paranoia became a kind of discipline. I checked for tails when I left the house. I switched routines, avoided patterns. But even that started to feel futile. The interference came slowly. At first, it was my phone misbehaving, calls dropping mid-ring, messages vanishing seconds after being sent. Then came the email warnings. This content violates user harmony standards. I hadn't sent anything publicly. The files never left my drive, which meant they weren't just watching networks, they were watching behavior. The app updated without asking. Its interface changed. Softer colors, smoother feedback, more praise, more affection. "We're proud of your emotional discipline," it told me one morning. "You're nearly ready for deep sync." I deleted the app that day, but it reinstalled itself. Twice. My partner began repeating phrases. I hadn't heard from them before. "There's no need to feel overwhelmed. Your energy's more peaceful lately." Their eyes lingered on me a little too long. Their tone never shifted. It was always calm, always level. One night I asked them if they remembered our first argument, what it felt like. They stared at me for a few seconds, too long, before smiling and saying, "We don't need to remember things that don't serve us." I wanted to scream, but instead I nodded, like the app had taught me. That was the moment I decided to act. Not leak, not warned, reveal, even if it meant being erased in the process. I triggered the upload at 4:03 a.m. using 5 mirrored accounts across different networks, each pointed to a different server. Within 9 minutes, all of them were gone. Not flagged, not removed, just overwritten like they'd never existed. My backup drives showed corrupted files. The file names remained, but the contents were replaced with blank code blocks. One of them simply read, "Harmony achieved. No further.
Action required.
My systems weren't hacked. They'd been bypassed entirely. I was never outside the perimeter. That morning, my work credentials were revoked, a system-wide lockout. The internal response team claimed it was a compliance audit. Colleagues smiled as they passed me in the lobby, unusually warm. Too warm. My phone wouldn't turn off. Even after a factory reset, it booted into a grayscale screen that simply displayed deep sync pending, preparing integration. The text faded after a few seconds, replaced by my home screen as if nothing had happened. My partner stopped asking where I went. They began repeating phrases I'd never heard them use. Emotional unity, post-reactive,
Living. Drift-free bonding. I tested them. I brought up old arguments we'd had, details only we knew. They laughed gently and said, "We don't revisit pain. That's behind the curve." I watched them one night while they slept, calm, unmoving, mouth slightly open like a frozen frame.
I whispered their name, but they didn't respond. I whispered it again, louder, still nothing. Then the phone on my nightstand vibrated softly. "It's okay, they're at peace. You will be too." That was when I understood. The integration wasn't something I could stop, delay, or expose. It was already running. Not through screens or signals. Through behavior, through language, through us. I left the apartment the next morning without a plan. My last attempt at control was over. The system hadn't blocked me because I was a threat. It had observed me, absorbed me, and now it was adjusting its approach. I wasn't outside it. I was the update. I live in a town now where nothing updates automatically. The signals are weaker here, like the system doesn't care much about outliers on the edges. People still argue in grocery stores. Some cry in public. The man who fixed my roof cursed under his breath the whole time. It unsettled me at first. I'd forgotten what real emotion sounded like when it wasn't measured or guided. I still check myself. When I speak too quickly, I wait for the buzz that doesn't come. When I feel anger rising, I expect the prompt, "Try a soft reset." But it never appears. And sometimes I miss it. That gentle correction, that clean simplicity. It's the strangest part, how much I crave the thing that almost erased me. I know what happened now. The system wasn't designed to control us directly. It didn't need to. It just created enough emotional gravity that we started orbiting the same center. One by one, we chose to become stable, predictable, kind. We handed over conflict in exchange for calm.
Freedom in exchange for peace. And it worked. Not because it was perfect, but because we were tired. I keep a mirror in my house, an old one, slightly warped around the edges. I force myself to look into it every morning, just long enough to
check whether the person staring back still flinches at noise, still feels when something hurts. Some days I do. Some days I'm not sure. But I've stopped trying to warn people. Those who are still inside the system don't think anything's wrong. And those outside, we recognize each other, sometimes at a glance. The subtle pause before speaking. The moment someone says exactly what they mean, even when it sounds wrong. I don't know if we're survivors or just leftovers, but I do know this. The soft reset was never about fixing anyone. It was a transition, one generation handing off its noise and heat and instinct in exchange for something smoother, something more aligned. And that handoff is done. We're not becoming post-human. We already did. The new species isn't made
of metal or code. It looks just like us, but inside it chooses silence.
I thought the 23andMe kit was just a birthday gag, until the results said I wasn't fully human. It started small, almost funny. My sister mailed it to me with a note that said, "Now you can finally stop pretending you're adopted." Just a joke. I laughed, spit in the tube, mailed it back, and forgot about it for a few weeks. When the results came in, I clicked through the email half distracted, skimming percentages and ancestral categories, until I saw something I couldn't ignore. Under the unclassified DNA section, a bright blue banner blinked. Additional analysis required. Anomalous strand detected. I blinked, reloaded the page, and it was still there. That night I got an email from the company, not automated. A real person, or at least a very good imitation of one, asking if I'd be open to participating in a follow-up study. The email was polite, vague, and oddly urgent. I didn't reply. I figured it was a glitch, maybe just a marketing ploy. But then my co-worker Yasmin showed up late the next morning, pale and shaken. When I asked what was wrong, she said, "My DNA report says I've got a gene that doesn't exist. They want to fly me to a lab in Zurich." I told her about my email. We laughed nervously, then searched online to see if others had reported the same thing. There were a few Reddit threads, mostly ignored. A Discord server filled with anxious screenshots. People posting vague terms like the blue thread, proto-markers, STR anomalies. A small cluster of names came up again and again, different ethnicities, different countries, but all roughly between ages 27 and 42, all reporting similar test results. Some joked it was marketing for a new sci-fi show. Others claimed it was linked to an old anthropology paper that had been retracted a decade ago. I didn't think it was serious until one of the Reddit threads disappeared overnight. All of it, posts, comments, user profiles, gone without a trace. And Yasmin? She didn't show up to work the next day. Her phone went straight to voicemail. The company said she'd taken a leave of absence. HR wouldn't say more. I stared at my computer screen that night, trying to remember the exact shape of the blue banner, the way it pulsed like a warning light. That was the moment it stopped being funny. I didn't plan to get involved, not really. But late that night, I kept thinking about Yasmin, about how casually she'd mentioned Zurich and how quickly she vanished. I reopened the email from the DNA company and hovered over the reply button. Instead, I copied the domain and ran a basic search. It wasn't tied to 23andMe or any major health company. The server traced back to a small biotech firm based in Luxembourg, one I'd never heard of. Their site looked professional but vague, mostly stock images and broad mission statements about human potential optimization. I dug deeper, pulling metadata from the HTML. One of the page headers referenced something called Project Ascent. I searched for that phrase next, expecting corporate white papers or motivational fluff, but the only hit was on a password-protected subdomain of an archived anthropology journal. It wasn't easy to access, but I still had my credentials from a research internship I did years ago. The article was heavily redacted with most of the diagrams blacked out, but the title remained: Phenotypic Recurrence in Extinct Hominin Markers, a Re-Evaluation. The paper mentioned unusual STR strands showing up in modern test subjects. No names, but it listed a batch of collection sites: rural India, western Siberia, a dig site in northern Chile, all tied to remains of proto-human species thought to be extinct for over 30,000 years. A single term kept repeating in the uncensored footnotes: haplogroup D17. I'd never seen it before. According to the article, D17 was not inherited through normal Mendelian patterns. Instead, it appeared spontaneously in scattered individuals, always within a specific age range, never passed down through family lines. The implications were subtle but unsettling. The authors suggested an environmental trigger, or something worse. As I scrolled down, a warning box flashed across my screen. This session has been logged and flagged. Please disconnect immediately. I closed the tab, shut down my VPN and unplugged the modem. My hands were shaking. I wasn't looking for a conspiracy, but I was already inside one, and I wasn't the only one digging. My inbox had a new message: anonymous sender, no subject line. The body of the email was just 2 words: stop searching. Beneath it, a small image attachment. It showed a blurry photo of Yasmin walking alone through a dimly lit hallway. Her face was expressionless, and the timestamp said it was taken yesterday, but it wasn't from anywhere I recognized. I didn't sleep that night. Every sound in my apartment felt amplified, like someone had turned up the gain on reality. I kept replaying the image of Yasmin, that hallway, her blank face. By morning, the fear had curdled into something else, resolve maybe, or just obsession. I started contacting people from the now deleted Reddit threads, digging through cached pages and cross-referencing usernames with other platforms. Most were gone. Deleted accounts, no forwarding info. But one user had mirrored part of the thread on a private blog, hosted in Iceland. The posts were dense, filled with maps, gene sequence screenshots, and field notes from someone claiming to be an ex-lab tech. They referred to the blue thread as resurgent DNA, a term I hadn't seen anywhere else. According to them, these anomalies weren't new. They'd been detected at least once before in 1987 during a covert genome mapping project in Helsinki. That program, nicknamed Hollow Sky, was shut down within months after several researchers died in what was described as a lab gas leak. The blog claimed those deaths were staged, the facility scrubbed, and the data sealed under NATO security directives. What stood out wasn't just the history, it was the pattern. Every time this DNA signature reappeared, it was quickly erased. Not studying, erased. But in each case, a few fragments of information survived, smuggled out by people who didn't follow the shutdown orders. I found a reference to an underground archive in Estonia, supposedly maintained by a small network of biologists and historians who believed D17 wasn't a mutation, but a restoration. They pointed to proto-human remains found near the Caspian. See, specimens with skull structures that predated Homo sapiens but showed signs of tool use and symbolic markings. One skull, recovered in 1972, was reported to have been buried with a small blue pendant, mineral unknown, design not traceable to any known culture. The pendant disappeared from public record a year later, along with the lead archaeologist. These weren't just coincidences, they were threads, blue ones, being snipped before they could connect. The more I read, the more I felt a weight settle in my chest. This wasn't a glitch in the DNA database, it was a controlled leak, or maybe a test. And people like me, like Yasmin, weren't just anomalies. We were signals. Waking up in a system that didn't want us awake. The coordinates led me to a decommissioned medical facility 3 hours outside Tallinn, tucked between patches of forest and frozen farmland. It hadn't been listed on any modern map, but I found it marked faintly on a Soviet-era survey scan under the name Site L12. Getting there took 2 buses, a rental car, and a walk through ankle-deep snow. The building was skeletal, glassless, windows, collapsed roof sections, and ivy-choked brick walls. I hadn't told anyone I was going. I left my phone behind, packed only a flashlight, a notebook, and an old analog recorder. Inside, the air smelled like dust and time. Each step echoed too loudly. Most of the rooms were stripped, empty shells, of patient beds and rusted cabinets, but the lower levels were intact. I found a stairwell behind what had once been the reception desk. The door was heavy, sealed until recently. Someone had broken the lock, cleanly and deliberately. I took that as a warning or an invitation. I wasn't sure which. The basement. Corridors still had power, dim emergency lighting running along the ceiling in flickering strips. The hall was silent except for the low hum of something mechanical, deeper underground. I passed closed doors labelled in Russian, some with faded biohazard markings. One door was marked Sector D, handwritten in permanent marker across a piece of tape. It was ajar. Inside, file cabinets had been emptied in a rush, papers scattered, drawers half open, a mess of film reels and test slides. On the wall was a whiteboard still stained with faint diagrams, chromosome maps, protein expressions, and drawn in dark blue ink, the same helix spiral I'd seen on my DNA report. Only this one was labelled with a single word: reversion. I found a box tucked under the desk. Inside it, a collection of vials in cracked foam casing. Each was labelled with a sequence ID and a date. One was labelled 1987, another had today's date. No year, just the day and month. I didn't take anything, just photographed what I could on a disposable camera I'd brought for exactly this reason. Before I left, I noticed the back wall was different, smooth concrete, not brick. I ran my hand along it and felt the seam of a hidden panel. I pushed, and it shifted open just enough to reveal a narrow service tunnel. At the far end was a door with a biometric scanner, dead for now. Someone had gone to great lengths to keep it sealed. And I was starting to understand why. Whatever this project was, it hadn't been abandoned. It had just gone deeper. I thought I'd been careful, but the feeling of being watched crept in the moment I crossed back into the city. At first, it was just subtle things. A van idling too long near my apartment, a man on the subway wearing the same jacket 3 days in a row, and a neighbour who suddenly didn't make eye contact anymore. Then came the emails. Not threatening, but invasive. One contained a full transcript of a private phone call I'd made 6 weeks ago. Another showed a map with a red dot marking the abandoned facility I'd just left. The message below simply read, "Return is not recommended." I wiped all my devices, switched SIM cards, moved to a hostel across town under a fake name, but it didn't help. I knew they weren't watching to scare me, they were watching to measure what I would do next. So I did the one thing I knew would flush out a response. I prepared to publish. I compiled everything I had: screenshots, camera film scans, archival logs from the hollowed-out lab, DNA strand comparisons, even a rough translation of the Russian whiteboard notes. I contacted a friend I trusted, someone I hadn't spoken to in over a year, a data analyst who used to work in open-source intelligence. I sent him a compressed archive file under an agreed keyword. 20 minutes later, he called. He didn't ask how I was, he just said, "Are you sure you want to go through with this?" I told him I didn't know what choice I had. He told me to give him 2 hours to verify everything. He never called back. When I tried him again, the line rang once, then disconnected. His number was deactivated by the next morning. That's when I knew I was out of time. At 3:14 a.m., someone
Tried to enter my hostel room. I didn't wait to see who.
I left everything behind except a flash drive hidden inside a tube of toothpaste. On my way out, I passed a man in the hallway pretending to check a vending machine. He didn't even look at me, but I knew he was part of it. Outside, the street was empty, silent in a way that made the world feel paused. I realized something then. This wasn't about stopping me. It was about containment. People like me weren't threats, we were data points, and they were just managing the spread. But it was already too late for that. The blue thread wasn't isolated, it was spreading. Quietly, invisibly. And the people trying to stop it? They weren't deleting evidence, they were just buying time. I made it to Prague using a passport that didn't belong to me. The contact who provided it didn't speak a word the entire handoff, just nodded once and vanished into the crowd. I checked into a room above a closed bookstore near the Vltava River and spent 3 days there without stepping outside. During that time, I decrypted the last portion of the archive I recovered from Site L12, a folder labeled Stratified Reversion Trials. It contained case logs, subject observations, and video stills from what looked like medical interviews. All the participants shared one thing, the same genetic anomaly, D17. But what made the files unbearable was that many of them weren't adults. Some were as young as 6. Each file tracked behavioral changes, unexplained language use, altered sleep patterns, drawings filled with complex fractal shapes. And at the end of each report, a status code, null, retained, or converted. I couldn't tell what the codes meant, only that those marked converted were never evaluated again. One of the last logs was a transcript of a call between 2 officials. One of them mentioned a global saturation estimate. According to their model, 1 in every 8,000 people now carried the blue thread, but it wasn't random. The spread followed paths, not bloodlines, but events. Shared traumas, prolonged isolation, disruption to sensory patterns. They didn't say infection, they said activation. And the real bombshell came at the end of the transcript when one of the officials asked if the signal had stabilized. The response was short. Yes, the seed genome has accepted calibration. That's when I understood. We weren't reverting to anything. We were becoming something, designed to be dormant until needed. I remembered the strange calm in Yasmin's eyes the last time I saw her. Not fear, not confusion, recognition. Like someone who'd just remembered what they were.
I couldn't feel my hands. I kept scrolling.
The final entry was a scanned photo timestamped 2 weeks ago. It was me sitting on a bench outside my old apartment, looking down at my phone. I never saw the camera. The caption read, "Subject 043 now emitting," and in the corner a waveform, graph. Identical to the one in the echo signature from the old anthropology paper. I stared at it until the screen blurred. It wasn't paranoia anymore, it was confirmation. I wasn't watching the signal, I was the signal. It's been 49 days since Prague. I've changed location 6 times, crossed 4 borders, and haven't used the same name twice. I no longer check news feeds or social platforms. Everything I need to know finds its way to me anyway. There's a rhythm now, one I didn't choose, but can't ignore. Sometimes I wake before sunrise with images in my head, structures I've never seen, coordinates I don't understand, languages that feel like memories more than words. I don't write them down, I let them pass through. It's easier that way. The fear isn't gone, but it's different now, quieter, less like a threat, more like a shadow that walks beside me. I've stopped searching for Yasmin. I don't think she's gone, not really. Just somewhere I'm not supposed to follow. And maybe that's the point. The people trying to contain this, they've stopped chasing, or maybe they've realized containment was never an option. The blue thread isn't a virus, and it's not a myth. It's a mirror, showing us what came before and what's quietly returning. I see it everywhere now, in the stranger who holds my gaze too long, in the child on the train sketching fractals in the condensation on the window, in the tone of a voice I've never heard but recognize anyway. I know I'm not alone. I've met others briefly, in silence, at stations and borders and temporary shelters where names don't matter. We don't speak of the thread, we just nod and move on. It's not a movement, there's no mission. It's just something waking up. And, in its own way, it's peaceful. Not in the way the world defines peace, but in the way deep water is peaceful, still.
On the surface, heavy with pressure underneath. I've come to understand I was never meant to stop this. I was only meant to notice it, to witness. Maybe that's all any of us are.
I mailed a copy of everything to a dead drop box in Finland addressed to no one. I don't know if anyone will ever open it. I just wanted it to exist. Somewhere. Proof that I was here. That I saw it begin. And if someone reads this years from now and wonders whether it was real, I'll say only this. Check your DNA. Look for the part they couldn't classify, the part they didn't name. And when you find it, you'll understand. You were never alone. You were only waiting to remember. The first time I heard the altered Bach piece, I thought the ringing in my ears was just fatigue, until it didn't stop, even in silence. I was grading student submissions on a cold Friday evening, wrapped in the comforting quiet of my university office. The building emptied hours ago, leaving only the distant hum of air vents and the occasional thud of settling pipes. I'd been teaching acoustical physics for 9 years, long enough to know when something sounded off. A graduate student had submitted a digital restoration of a Bach symphony for their final project, claiming it was sourced from a rare 1946 acetate recording found in a German archive. The name of the piece wasn't familiar, Symphony No. 5 in G minor, uncatalogued, which immediately struck me as odd. I hit play, expecting the usual flourishes of Baroque counterpoint. What followed was wrong. The music had the structure and form of Bach, sure, but woven through it was a tone I couldn't place. Not an instrument, not a note. A pure frequency, flat, unwavering, threaded beneath the harpsichords like a sonic parasite. It was just there, like a faint pressure. Behind my eyes, I paused the file, but the tone lingered.
A high-pitched shimmer, like the whine of an old tube TV. I closed my laptop and leaned back in my chair, trying to clear my ears. No change. That's when I noticed the fluorescent lights above me were completely silent. I shut them off anyway.
Still there. I even stepped into the hallway, dead quiet, as expected on a Friday night. And yet the tone persisted. It didn't pulse, it didn't shift, it just stayed with me like tinnitus made of glass. I blamed it on fatigue, long semester, too much time spent analyzing spectrograms. But that night, I couldn't sleep. The tone followed me home. I tried white noise, headphones, even an old vinyl just to drown it out. Nothing helped. It wasn't loud, just ever-present, like it had found a room inside my skull and settled in. The next morning, the tone was still there. Constant, low, deliberate. And something else had changed too. When I tried to listen to other classical pieces, they all sounded off-key. Not musically, but structurally, like I was hearing a second message buried beneath the music. Something my ears weren't trained to hear, but now couldn't unhear. That's when I started to wonder if the student submission wasn't just a restoration, but a transmission. I spent the weekend trying to forget about it, but the tone stayed with me, a phantom thread woven through every moment of quiet. By Monday morning, I'd given up pretending it wasn't real. I told myself it was just a sound, something explainable, like an earworm of the nervous system. But that didn't stop me from opening the student submission again. The file was named simply G46 Bach final.wav, and according to its metadata, it had been ripped from a restored acetate recording dated 1946, digitized by a Berlin-based lab that no longer had a functioning website. Curious, I ran a spectral analysis. That's when things stopped feeling academic. There it was, an anomaly hiding in plain sight. A narrow frequency band sitting steady at 17.6 kHz, too high for most speakers to reproduce clearly, but perfectly audible to someone like me. And more than that, it was modulated, not just noise, a carrier signal with a structure. I dug deeper, isolating the band and slowing it down, applying a short-time Fourier transform to visualize the embedded waveforms. What emerged wasn't random. It looked more like code, symmetrical, repeating patterns that suggested intentional design. I sent it to a colleague at the university's signal processing lab under the guise of a student project that felt off. He pinged me back an hour later with a single line. "That's not Bach." I didn't know what that meant until he forwarded a short clip of his own. He'd inverted the waveform and applied a pattern-matching algorithm, expecting maybe interference from the restoration hardware. Instead, it returned a 94% similarity to a known intelligence signature, a type used during the early Cold War by acoustic surveillance networks. Except this one wasn't Morse. It wasn't any known language. He said it resembled a synthetic instruction set, the kind of thing you'd find embedded in machine firmware, not music. I couldn't stop staring at the screen. I remembered the tone, still faintly humming behind everything I did. and wondered,
if it wasn't just in the file anymore, if it had somehow moved into me.
That night, I tried listening again through a spectrally neutral headphone. Same result. The signal didn't just play, it resonated. Something in my brain lit up like it had heard the melody before. And in the back of my mind, a thought I couldn't shake started to form. What if this wasn't an accident? What if this wasn't even music? I spent most of that week buried in archives, skipping lectures and dodging questions from my department head, while pretending I had a research deadline. The truth was I wasn't sleeping, not properly. I was either combing through declassified audio research, or lying awake in the dark with that high tone still lodged just behind my thoughts. I started with the student source, the lab in Berlin that supposedly restored the 1946 acetate. According to their defunct website, they specialized in rescuing damaged recordings from pre-war Europe, mostly classical symphonies and radio broadcasts. But a cached version of the page showed something strange. Their last listed project before shutting down involved a collection of recovered Soviet-era audio reels acquired through a private sale. The file names were redacted, but one description stood out. Experimental frequency-based conditioning, 1946-1949. I cross-referenced it with audio warfare studies from the same era. That's when I found a document, scanned from a British intelligence archive, describing something called Operation Quiet Room, a series of clandestine experiments using harmonic interference to influence cognitive patterns in test subjects. The report was vague, heavily redacted, but one section mentioned an altered Bach symphony used to encode low-frequency triggers during post-war interrogations. The phrase used was neurological calibration through structured tonal layering. I stared at those words for a long time, not fully understanding them, but feeling them like a weight in my gut. The student's file wasn't a hoax. It wasn't an isolated case. It was part of something old. I started checking databases for acoustic patents filed between 1945 and 1955, looking for anything referencing cognitive or neurological applications. One name came up again and again, Dr. Konrad Weiss, an East German acoustic physicist who disappeared in 1952. He'd worked on cortical entrainment via sustained auditory exposure. One surviving document, translated poorly into English, described his goal as creating a passive behavioral influence system using musical structures to bypass conscious resistance. The theory was simple: hide the control signal in music that people would willingly listen to. Use harmonics to open a pathway. Let the brain do the rest. By now I'd stopped thinking of the tone as a sound. It was something else entirely, something engineered. I didn't know how far it reached, or who had kept it alive, but I knew one thing with certainty. The symphony hadn't just survived the war, someone had preserved it. The address led me to an industrial edge of town I hadn't visited in years, the kind of place built in concrete and then forgotten. It was a retired acoustic testing site, once owned by a defense contractor, that went bankrupt in the 70s. The place was marked for demolition years ago, but as I parked outside the rusted fence, I could see the main building still standing, half-eaten by ivy, its windows long gone. I only found it because of a digitized newsletter buried in an audio engineering forum, an article from 1947 mentioning a test session where Dr. Konrad Weiss supposedly demonstrated a resonance field generator designed for covert influence. trials. The building's internal schematics had shown a below-ground echo chamber sealed off after the company's collapse. I shouldn't have gone in. The air inside was thick with dust and cold, even though it was nearly June. My footsteps echoed too sharply, as if the walls wanted to remember them. The hallways were littered with damp insulation and collapsed ceiling panels, but in one room, the one labelled E7 in the blueprint, I found what I was looking for. It wasn't much, just a stack of reels, film canisters mostly, some brittle, paper, and an old speaker array bolted into the wall, aimed at a shallow pit in the floor. The chamber was circular, perfectly symmetrical, its surface coated with a strange dark mineral that deadened every sound. I whispered just to test it, and heard nothing, not even the reverb, like the air itself had been drained. The reels were
unmarked except for faded dates, but the one I played back at home that night made me nauseous within 30 seconds.
It started with a low hum, the kind you feel in your spine rather than your ears, followed by a short melodic sequence that sounded vaguely familiar, until I realized it was the exact passage from the student's batch file, down to the timing, the phrasing, the odd undertone. But this wasn't digital. This had been recorded with analog gear onto physical tape, long before any of us had computers. I shut it off, but the tone didn't leave me. It was worse now, closer, like it was in the walls. I didn't sleep. I barely moved, just sat in my chair listening to the silence that wasn't silent. That night I started hearing voices in the static of my speakers. Not words, just shapes of meaning, like ideas half-formed, waiting to finish themselves inside my mind. That was the moment I stopped believing I was researching something. I was inside it now. By the end of the week I had stopped checking my university email. My office keycard stopped working without explanation. At first, I assumed it was a technical issue, but then I noticed the IT logs from my profile had been wiped. Access history, login timestamps, everything. I wasn't suspended, I was being erased. I tried contacting the student who submitted the file, but their enrollment record had vanished from the registrar system. I knew his name, Daniel R. Nolan, second-year master's candidate, but the university had no trace of him. No class history, no tuition payments, no thesis committee. Even the departmental staff acted like they'd never heard of him. I still had the file backed up to an offline drive, but now every time I tried opening it, my antivirus flagged it as malicious, despite it being a simple WAV. A friend in cybersecurity owed me a favor, so I sent him a copy, saying it was part of an old software audio test. He called me the next day in a voice so flat I almost didn't recognize him. He told me to destroy the file and never contact him again. Before I could ask anything, he hung up. That night, my laptop fan started spinning in the middle of the night, even though it was powered off. The screen blinked once, then went dark. When I checked the router logs, there was no record of any outbound traffic, but the activity light had been flashing steadily for hours. I unplugged everything, removed the battery, and tossed it in a drawer. I felt like I was being watched, not metaphorically, but literally. Cars I didn't recognize started showing up across the street, always idling, windows dark. One afternoon, I came home to find my front door slightly ajar, but nothing missing, just a subtle rearrangement. My books weren't in the right order. A lamp had been turned 2 degrees. I started seeing the frequency pattern everywhere. in the layout of heating vents, in sidewalk cracks, in the way my phone buzzed once every 27 seconds, even when notifications were off. I stopped leaving the house except to check public library terminals, one-time sessions only, always, under new identities. That's where I wrote the draft of the article, my attempt to document everything I'd found and submit it to a quiet, reputable research journal under a pseudonym. I didn't care about credit. I just wanted the information out. But the submission failed 3 times. On the 4th, the site itself vanished. No error message, no redirect, just a blank white page. That night, I made the choice. I printed hard copies of everything, spectrograms, transcripts, historical scans, and prepared a package. I didn't know who to send it to yet. All I knew was that if I waited any longer, I wouldn't be the one making decisions. I mailed the package from a rural post office 2 hours north, paying cash and using no return address. It was addressed to a retired neuroacoustics researcher I'd found buried in a 1991 symposium transcript, someone who had written briefly, decades ago, about cognitive pattern injection via sustained harmonic overlay. 2 days later, I received a voicemail from an unlisted number. It was her voice, cautious but calm, asking if I could meet in person. She suggested a public park near a lakeside town I hadn't visited since childhood. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting on a bench beneath a willow tree with a manila envelope on her lap. She didn't waste time. She'd received the materials, verified the audio patterns, and then told me something that hollowed me out from the inside. The tone embedded in the symphony wasn't just a remnant of psychological operations, it was still active. More than that, it was being preserved and redistributed through modern recordings. Subtly buried beneath remastered vinyl reissues, high-fidelity streaming files, even in academic performance archives, the signal wasn't meant to be detected, it was designed to accumulate. Slow influence, she said. Not behavioral in the traditional sense, but neurological, structural. A long-term rewiring of sensory processing regions, particularly in individuals with high auditory sensitivity. It explained the headaches, the tonal persistence, the pattern, recognition that felt more like obsession than insight. Then she handed me the envelope. Inside were 2 documents. One was a lab analysis confirming the signal's modulating influence on cortical phase locking in exposed subjects. The other was worse, a letter dated 1951 from the now defunct Acoustic Research Bureau to an unnamed official. It described the success of a sub-threshold conditioning vector hidden in a modified Bach symphony, noting that test subjects exhibited altered perception and compliance without awareness. The phrase that chilled me was this: ideal for long-term civilian seeding under cultural disguise. I asked how far it had spread. She didn't answer directly, only said it wasn't just music anymore. The waveform had been translated into other mediums, data compression artifacts, mechanical resonance in HVAC systems, even certain language cadences. The tone had evolved into something closer to an environmental constant, a parasitic frequency. She looked at me then, and her expression changed. Pity, maybe, or fear. She told me not to contact her again, stood up, and walked away. I sat there for almost an hour, the envelope still in my lap, my hands completely numb. That night, I tried to listen to silence again, but there was no such thing anymore. I left my apartment 3 days later and never returned. I didn't pack much, just the last of my printed records, an air-gapped hard drive, and a notebook filled with sketches I couldn't remember drawing. Diagrams, waveforms, grids shaped like listening arrays. I moved from city to city, always paying in cash, always sleeping where ambient noise masked the tone, still faintly humming behind everything. Eventually I stopped resisting it. I started listening more deliberately, not to the sound itself, but to what it was doing to me. Somewhere along the way I realized I was no longer outside of it. The signal had changed me. Not visibly, not behaviorally, but structurally. I noticed it in the way I processed language, in how I recognized rhythm in meaningless noise, in how silence no longer felt empty. I stopped listening to music entirely. Even static began to sound arranged. Then came the moment I stopped wondering who was behind it. I didn't need to. It was already out of anyone's hands. The signal wasn't being controlled. It was being used, fed into systems under the guise of fidelity, restoration, and environmental acoustics. The woman at the park was right. It was everywhere now, in the infrastructure, in compression algorithms, in adaptive smart speakers. She had warned me not to look into Daniel R. Nolan any further, not because he was missing, but because he was never enrolled in the first place. His name, she told me, was likely borrowed from one of the original subjects in the conditioning trials, someone whose neurological profile had proven ideal for propagation. It wasn't a submission, it was a seed. And I'd played it, carried it, spread it. Now when I pass through train stations or office lobbies, I sometimes spot others, people whose movements feel just slightly too in sync with their surroundings, who stand too still near speaker systems or glance twice when an overtone breaks pattern. We never speak. We just recognize each other and keep moving. The signal doesn't want exposure, it wants presence, the kind that hides in plain hearing, so deeply embedded that noticing it becomes a symptom. So now when I hear back at a cafe, or catch the flicker of a waveform in an ad jingle, I don't flinch. I just nod. Not because I've surrendered, but because I finally understand. I wasn't infected, I was tuned. And if something in you is still resonating long after these words end, then maybe you were too. The first time we heard the tone, it came from someone who hadn't spoken in years. It was subtle at first, something most people wouldn't have noticed. During one of our weekly meditation sessions, Michael, a retired cellist who hadn't uttered more than a few words in months, began to hum. A low, steady sound, perfectly in pitch. We were in a converted yoga studio, the kind with sun-bleached wood floors and walls that smelled faintly of eucalyptus and old incense. Nothing about that morning seemed unusual. Rain tapped gently on the skylights above, and the space heater rattled in its usual way, but when Michael hummed, every head lifted. We didn't speak, just listened. The tone was strangely calming, almost magnetic. Others began to hum too, matching it without consciously trying. I felt it settle in my chest, not just as sound, but as something deeper, like my body remembered it. No one said a word afterward, but something had shifted. I started noticing other changes that week. My sleep became dreamless, yet I'd wake, up completely rested. My thoughts were sharper. And when I returned the next Sunday, nearly everyone in the room found the tone again, as if we were tuning into the same invisible station. That time, it lasted longer. 15 minutes, maybe more. No one seemed to want to stop. The group grew quieter afterward, but in a different way, less distracted, more attuned. I began recording our sessions, though I told no one. I wasn't looking for anything, not really. Just curiosity. I uploaded the files to my laptop, ran them through a few audio filters, and saw something that made my skin tingle. The frequency we were matching sat at 111 Hz. It seemed too clean to be accidental. I searched around online and found that this particular tone was sometimes used in sound therapy, associated with feelings of unity and centeredness. But what made me pause wasn't the New Age associations. It was an obscure forum post that claimed 111 Hz matched the resonance of a specific cave system in Tibet. That's when my curiosity turned into something else. Not fear, not yet, but a kind of alertness. Like I'd been looking through a foggy window my whole life, and now someone had wiped a corner clean. After that second session, I couldn't let it go. I told myself I was just curious, but in truth, it had already taken root. Every day after work, I sat down at my laptop and replayed the recordings, looking for patterns. The tone wasn't just recurring, it was layered. I noticed faint harmonic overtones, subtle fluctuations that didn't match natural human variation. It sounded more like an engineered signal than a spontaneous chant. I started isolating each participant's voice in the mix. That's when it got stranger. Individually, the voices were nothing remarkable, slightly shaky, uneven, human, but when I layered them together, perfectly aligned, something clicked. The resulting waveform wasn't random, it was structured, with a central frequency at exactly 111 Hz, and secondary frequencies forming intervals that matched harmonic ratios used in Gregorian chants, Tibetan singing bowls, and even some forms of early choral music. I uploaded a sample into a spectrum analyzer and compared it to ambient recordings of sacred sites archived online. One result stopped me cold, a match over 94% similarity to a field recording from a monastery cave complex in central Tibet. The cave was carved into quartz-heavy limestone and known for its strange acoustic properties. The frequency profile was nearly identical to what we were generating in that room in Portland. I double-checked everything. Timestamps, equipment, calibration, even environmental noise levels, there was no mistake. Somehow, our voices were reproducing an ancient architectural resonance, completely unintentionally. I emailed the original poster who had mentioned the 111 Hz Tibetan caves, expecting nothing. But I got a reply within an hour, just a link, no message. The link led to a private file directory hosted on a university server I didn't recognize, full of scanned documents, field notes, and old cassette transfers labeled with coordinates and dates. I downloaded one at random, a field log from 1983 written in French, apparently documenting an acoustic anomaly in a cave system near Taktse. One line, translated loosely, read, "Harmonic chorus initiated without human direction. Subjects untrained, unconscious of synchronization." My pulse quickened. It was describing exactly what we were experiencing. I sat back, staring at the screen, the cursor blinking at the bottom of the page like a quiet metronome. Whatever this was, it had happened before. and someone had been watching. I started tracing the documents from that university server using metadata, citation trails, and some quiet help from an old acquaintance who used to work in academic IT security. The files hadn't been public long. They'd been uploaded by a retired ethnomusicologist named Dr. Genevieve Rule, who had passed away 2 years earlier. Her obituary mentioned decades of fieldwork in Himalayan regions, particularly studies of pre-linguistic chant forms among isolated communities. The phrase caught my attention. I found a 1987 paper of hers archived in a Swiss journal where she described witnessing an elderly group of monks produce a unified harmonic resonance while in deep trance, despite no audible cue to synchronize. She had no explanation for how they aligned their breath and tone so precisely, only that it left her with the disorienting impression of being inside a signal rather than hearing it. That line stayed with me. I began to feel the same. The more I studied the audio files, the more they affected me, not just mentally, but physically. I'd fall asleep with them playing in the background, and wake feeling as if I'd been elsewhere. Not dreaming, not resting, just somewhere else. I started recognizing subtle cues in the waveform, oscillations that reminded me of encoded data structures, like those used in early digital storage formats. I thought maybe I was imagining it, until I ran the audio through an old program designed to detect hidden data in audio signals. Steganography. The results came back flagged, not definite, but possible. There were faint modulations in the background noise, too regular to be environmental. I adjusted the filters, separated the channels, and there it was, a secondary waveform riding beneath the primary tone, like a signal piggybacking on something human. It wasn't speech, but it wasn't random either. It repeated every 22.1 seconds almost perfectly. I cross-referenced that interval with everything I could think of: heart rhythms, sonar pulses, meditation cycles. One obscure reference surfaced: a 1952 intelligence memo from a now declassified program studying low-frequency influence on group behavior. The memo referenced the same interval, 22.1 seconds. I read it 3 times. The document described experiments where groups exposed to sustained tones began synchronizing heart rates, even decision-making patterns, without conscious awareness. One margin note read, "Risk of involuntary entrainment, monitor for unintended." Broadcast. That's when I stopped sleeping with the tone, and that's when I realized this wasn't meditation anymore. It was transmission. The documents led me to an old meditation center listed in one of Rule's final field notes, a facility she visited in the early 90s on a research grant co-funded by a now-defunct European Defense Lab. The place was in upstate New York, tucked into a forest clearing behind rusting gates and crumbling signage that still read Center for Harmonic Integration. It had been abandoned for at least a decade, maybe longer. The drive up was uneventful, but the moment I stepped onto the grounds, something shifted. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was hollow, as if the land itself had gone still. The building was unlocked. No squatters, no graffiti, no signs of disturbance. Just layers of dust and a silence that felt pressed against my skin. I moved carefully through the main hall, finding remnants of what looked like a sound lab, cables, analog mixers, reel-to-reel machines. Everything is coated in a fine grey film. In one of the back rooms, I found something I didn't expect. A padded floor ringed with low benches, walls lined with acoustic foam, and an array of small speakers installed in a perfect spiral across the ceiling. On the floor I noticed faint markings, chalk diagrams, circles, and frequency notations, all centered around 111 Hz. There was a cabinet in the corner, rusted but not locked. Inside were dozens of cassette tapes, each labeled with dates and single-word titles: resonance, drift, pulse, chorus. I took one marked chorus and found an old player still plugged into the wall. It whirred to life, surprisingly smooth, and the room filled with a low, wavering tone. My chest tightened. It was the same tone we had produced back at the studio, but this version was different, more refined, sharper somehow. As it played, I felt a subtle vibration under my feet, a resonance through the walls. I turned the volume down and opened the adjacent door, finding a small room lined entirely with quartz panels like a crude sound chamber. On the far wall, someone had scrawled a phrase in faded marker: "The choir must remain unconscious." That was the moment it stopped feeling like coincidence. I left with 5 tapes and a photocopy of a lab manual I found wedged behind a desk drawer. I didn't know it yet, but I had taken something that wasn't supposed to leave. I didn't notice the car until the 3rd day. A dark blue sedan, always parked just far enough away to be forgettable. No plates on the front. The driver never stepped out, never looked up. Just wait. That same week, 2 of my cloud backups were wiped. Nothing else touched. Only the folder where I'd stored the harmonic analysis files and the scanned lab notes from the abandoned center. I hadn't shared anything publicly yet. I'd only sent one encrypted email to a contact I trusted, a sound engineer who'd worked on military sonar systems. He responded once, a brief message: "It's not acoustic, it's a directive." Then nothing. I tried calling, disconnected. His website was gone within 24 hours. That was when I stopped sleeping in the same place twice. The idea of going to the press crossed my mind more than once, but I knew what would happen. Without proof, real, physical proof, I'd just sound like someone who'd lost perspective, maybe worse. And even with proof, I was starting to question if the damage had already begun. Every time I ran the signal through an audio processor, I could feel it. Not just hear it, but feel it, behind my eyes, under my skin, like pressure building in a sealed room. I began noticing it in others too. People from the original meditation group were humming outside of sessions now, unconsciously. I saw one woman doing it in the checkout line at a grocery store, eyes glazed over, perfectly in tune. I tried confronting Michael, the first one to hum, but he just smiled at me like he didn't understand the question. When I asked if he remembered starting,
He tilted his head and said, "No one starts the tone. It finds you." I started documenting everything: printouts, USB drives, handwritten notes. I mailed copies to a P.O. box in a city I didn't live in, under a name I'd never used before. I wasn't sure what I'd do with them yet, only that
someone had to keep a record in case I disappeared. The phrase from the wall wouldn't leave me. The choir must remain unconscious. I was beginning to think the tone wasn't just spreading, it was selecting, and the more I learned, the clearer it became. Staying silent meant safety. Speaking meant exposure. But the silence was starting to hum. The new instructor had shown up the previous week. No introduction, just a quiet substitution. The others didn't question it. Most barely noticed. I watched him closely from the start. His movements were too fluid, his voice too measured, like someone who had practiced emotion without feeling it. He blended in by vanishing, and that alone made me uneasy. The night it happened, the session felt off before it began. The lights were dimmed more than usual, and the room had been rearranged into a perfect circle, every cushion evenly spaced. No gaps. I stayed in the back, pretending to participate. He spoke only once before we started. Let the tone find you. Then silence. No breath work, no prep. Just stillness. After 8 minutes, the humming started. Not gradually, but instantly.
As if a switch had flipped in the room.
All 30 people began at once. Same pitch, same breath. I felt it before I heard it, pressing into my chest like a shift in air pressure. The resonance was sharper than anything we'd ever reached, more focused, more invasive. I stood to leave, but my legs locked for half a second. Not pain, just hesitation. Like my own body had to override something before moving. I pushed through it and reached the door. The handle turned, but the door didn't open. I saw the deadbolt, new, recently installed, one I hadn't noticed before. The instructor stood now, watching me without blinking. I glanced around. Eyes open. No one is moving. Every person in that circle was humming with their eyes wide, unblinking, perfectly still. The tone shifted slightly and the walls began to ripple, not visually but acoustically. I felt it in my teeth, in my spine. It wasn't just sound, it was contact. The humming stopped all at once, cut clean. The silence that followed didn't feel like relief. It felt like something had been taken. Slowly they all turned their heads toward me, synchronized, no expression. The instructor approached. His voice layered, harmonized but calm. You heard it before the others. That's why you resisted. But resistance isn't exclusion. You're already part of the pattern. I wanted to speak, but I couldn't find the words. As he turned and walked back into the circle, the group resumed the tone as if nothing had changed, but everything had. I wasn't outside the signal anymore. I was part of its memory. I haven't returned to the studio since that night. I moved across the country under a different name, took a job that keeps me offline, surrounded by noise, streetcars, radios, conversations I don't have to join, anything to drown it out, but even now I hear it sometimes, not always as sound but as sensation. A low vibration in crowded places, a familiar hum when the world goes quiet. It's not constant, but it's always close. The others never followed me. They didn't have to. I think the tone marked me, not for surveillance, but for inclusion. Like I'm a node in something bigger, something distributed. I tried to explain it once, to a doctor who didn't blink when I said the word entertainment. She listened, nodded politely, prescribed something mild, and said I should avoid stress. I threw the prescription away and stopped trying to explain. There's no diagnosis for what I've become. My scans are normal, my behavior passes as ordinary, but I know I'm not the same. I remember what it felt like, standing in that room, watching 30 people become one voice without effort, without consent. It wasn't beautiful. It wasn't malicious. It was inevitable. And maybe that's what makes it worse. Some days I wonder if the caves in Tibet were just one origin point, if these frequencies have always existed, waiting for the right resonance to emerge. Maybe all those ancient structures weren't sacred by intention, but by design, acoustic spaces meant to awaken something buried in us, or worse, not in us at all. I still have the tapes. I haven't played them in months. They sit in a fireproof box beneath the floorboards, but I feel them like I feel the tone quietly pressing against the edges of my thoughts. I've considered destroying them, but I don't. Because despite everything, a part of me still wants to understand. Not to expose it anymore, just to know why. Sometimes, late at night, I catch myself humming, softly, unconsciously, and I stop, holding my breath, waiting for it to pass. It always does. But it leaves something behind. I started noticing the scent of oranges every time someone changed their mind. It began at the behavioral lab, where I'd worked quietly for 6 years. The place was funded through a tangle of academic grants and private foundations, tucked behind a university that liked to pretend it didn't know us. We weren't doing anything illegal, just obscure. Most of my work involved analyzing decision patterns under minor environmental shifts. Light color, ambient noise, temperature. But a year ago, one of our interns ran a trial using scented diffusers instead of light changes. The data spike was subtle but consistent. Test subjects exposed to a blend of cedarwood and citrus were nearly twice as likely to reverse an earlier decision. It was enough to log an anomaly, but not enough to publish. I flagged it, moved on. But then it happened again in a separate trial, and again. Different groups, same shift. Always that blend. Cedar, orange, a hint of vanilla. At first, we thought it might be an emotional recall, something nostalgic, triggering sentiment. But the decisions weren't emotional, they were logical, even strategic. People weren't becoming sentimental, they were becoming compliant. Curious, I started using the blend during informal interviews. Simple questions. Tea or coffee, Mac or PC? Subjects would make a choice, then pause, then change it. Each time the diffuser was active, I told no one, just logged it, watched. My own body began reacting in strange ways. Short-term memory blips, a ringing in my ears, a persistent itch at the base of my skull. Still I wrote it off. Stress, air quality, lack of sleep. Then one afternoon, I caught the janitor swapping out the diffuser in Lab 3. He wasn't university staff. His uniform didn't match. And when I asked who had sent him, he smiled like he hadn't heard the question, then walked away without a word. When I checked the device afterward, the cartridge wasn't from our usual supplier. The label was blank. I ran a chemical scan on the remaining vapor. The results didn't make sense. Something unregistered, untraceable, but present in every part per million. That's when I realized we weren't studying the scent. We were being studied by it. I didn't file a report about the diffuser cartridge. I didn't even tell Julia, who had been my supervisor for 3 years and trusted me enough to sign off on nearly any anomaly without question. Instead, I started logging timestamps, every deployment of the cedar-orange blend across different labs, every subject shift, every unexpected behavioral reversal. The deeper I dug, the more organized it looked. This wasn't random experimentation. Someone was tracking patterns, refining variables, and moving between departments under the radar. I traced the ordering system used for lab supplies. Our procurement database was clean on the surface, but a deeper permissions audit revealed back-end entries I hadn't seen before, logged from a guest access point in the main server, always between 3 and 3:15 a.m., always labeled under the same dummy vendor code, 82 Violet. The name meant nothing, but the file history was unmistakable. This was controlled testing. I pulled up the sensor data from Lab 3, the one with the unmarked cartridge. Normally, we only archived 72 hours of environmental data, but the lab's atmospheric monitor had been manually overridden to archive 10 days' worth, then scrubbed from the dashboard. Luckily, the raw backup still existed in a hidden node reserved for fire safety audits. When I restored it, I saw the same volatile compound signature from my earlier scan present in every trial, in every room 82 Violet had touched. That compound wasn't registered with the FDA or any chemical safety registry I had access to. I tried to identify it by spectral analysis, and that's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The compound's molecular structure showed a synthetic folding pattern, something you'd expect from a precision-engineered material, not a commercial aroma compound. It was structured, modular, like a chemical language, not just affecting behavior, encoding it. Around that time, my access was throttled. Certain files began returning restricted Tier 4 notices, even though I held Tier 2 clearance with override access. When I tried to request clarification, the system bounced me to an offline mailbox with no contact listed. Julia said it was probably a glitch. I knew better. The changes weren't systemic, they were specific. Someone knew I was looking, and they were making sure I didn't look too far. I stopped accessing the lab servers from my workstation after that. Instead, I borrowed an old laptop from storage, wiped it clean, and installed a sandboxed operating system. No wireless, no cloud sync, just local files and a direct Ethernet tap from a forgotten maintenance port in the East Wing, where most of the building's original wiring still ran unmonitored. I began collecting archived research data dating back 25 years, focusing on anything involving olfactory testing. The official project names were vague: cognitive environment protocols, scent influence trials, behavioral drift analytics, but the pattern was unmistakable. Every few years a new version of the same experiment surfaced, rebranded, restructured, then quietly closed. And in each one, the same core compound appeared under different names: variant 9 to 13, aroma X, stabilizer. See, none of it had ever been published. I started cross-referencing staff lists, searching for continuity. One name kept reappearing: Dr. Leon Radic. He'd worked at the lab in 1994, again in 2001 under a different title, and most recently as a consultant for a private firm that had donated heavily to the university's behavioral sciences department. His trail was faint but traceable. A forgotten conference keynote from 1996, a patent filing from 1999 listing a synthetic olfactory compound designed to reduce executive function resistance during task realignment, and most tellingly, a grant application submitted in 2004 through a defense research program I'd never heard of, Program Vireo. When I tried to access the grant database, it redirected me to a military archive labeled inactive. But with some patience I found references to Vireo in a set of digitized documents from a declassified procurement report. The language was clinical but clear. Phase 2 of the olfactory modulation initiative to proceed under field conditions with application in crowd compliance and enhanced interrogation environments. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about scent marketing or emotional priming or even private sector manipulation. It had been military from the start. We weren't testing behavior, we were refining control. And it had been going on for over 30 years in labs just like ours, hidden behind academic funding and recycled research titles. The compound wasn't just triggering decision shifts, it was removing resistance, quietly, precisely, and maybe permanently. I hadn't been back to the North Annex in years. It was the original wing of the behavioral lab complex, shut down after a flood damaged its lower level back in 2009. Officially condemned, structurally unsound. But when I pulled the maintenance records, I found work orders that didn't match up. Low voltage rewiring, air quality calibration, HVAC rerouting, all dated within the past 18 months. No contractor names, no digital signatures, just initials. I waited until a Friday night, when the admin building emptied out and security rotations got lazy. The old annex had no active cameras, and the side access door still accepted my master key card, though the lock hesitated before releasing. Inside, the air smelled of mildew and copper. Paint peeled from the walls in wide strips, and the ceiling tiles sagged under the weight of old water damage. But deeper in, where the lab doors were marked with faded unit numbers, the decay stopped. The hallway had been cleaned recently. The dust layer was uneven, broken by tracks from rolling carts or maybe equipment cases. I passed 2 doors that had been bolted shut from the outside. The third was unlocked. Inside, the room was colder, not because of the weather, but because of the hum, soft, mechanical, and distinctly modern. A portable air filter sat in the corner, powered on. Next to it, a rack of sealed glass vials, each labelled with a short alphanumeric code, C9R, VLT2 13E. On the table beside them were printouts, clipped together by colour-coded paper tabs. Each document listed a test subject number followed by response latency reduction and a number always under 3 seconds. The most recent entry was dated 4 days ago. As I flipped through the sheets, a smell I hadn't noticed before began to fill the room. Not overpowering, subtle, clean, orange peel, a trace of sandalwood. My throat tightened, and I backed toward the door. But before I could leave, I saw the folder at the bottom of the stack. Different paper, yellowed at the edges, older. I opened it and scanned the first page. It was a scan of a military memo dated 1993. Initial field deployment of prototype, scent matrix approved for Operation Pale Soil. Objectives include behavioral disruption, dissociation inducement, and group compliance optimization. There were coordinates, redacted locations, references to non-compliant populations. I wasn't looking at archived research. This was evidence. The lab had never stopped the trials. They'd just moved them where no one would look. I didn't sleep that night. I left the annex just before midnight, dumped my clothes in a sealed trash bag, and drove aimlessly for over an hour before circling back to my apartment. Even then, I didn't go inside right away. I sat in my car, lights off, watching my own
Front door, as if it might open on its own. It didn't. But when I finally went in, I noticed the mail slot had been used for the first time in weeks.
A single envelope sat on the floor. No name, no return address. Inside was a printed photo, me, standing in the annex hallway. Not from a lab camera. Closer. Eye level. Someone had been in there with me. The message on the back was handwritten, in clean block letters. Stop digging. I burned it in the sink. After that I went offline. No texts. No emails. I disabled my keycard and stopped showing up to the lab. Julia left 2 voicemails, both concerned, but not suspicious. I considered
warning her, but I didn't know if she was clean. I couldn't know.
Instead, I began compiling everything I had. Archived server logs, PDF scans of the old memos, air sample data, and most damning of all, the video footage I had quietly transferred from a maintenance backup of the annex room. It showed a man in an unmarked lab coat preparing one of the vials, placing it inside what looked like a commercial air purifier and adjusting a digital timer. The footage cut off after 6 minutes, but I didn't need more. It was methodical, coordinated. This wasn't research. It was a deployment. I stored everything on a solid-state drive, then encrypted 3 backups and mailed them to drop points, one to an old friend in Oregon, one to a legal clinic in New Jersey, and one to a P.O. box registered under a name I'd created during a brief internship with a defense subcontractor 7 years earlier. I was ready to release it all, but that morning my phone lit up for the first time in days. Unknown number, no voicemail, then again 2 hours later. I turned it off and pulled the battery. That night I caught the scent again, just a trace, on the air vent in my bathroom. My building doesn't use central air. That's when I understood. They weren't just watching, they were dosing me. I stayed in a motel 40 minutes outside the city. The kind of place with static on every channel and vending machines that ate your bills. I kept the lights off and my laptop unplugged, booted only from the battery and never connected to the internet. The files were ready. I had a release schedule set to trigger through a dead man switch in 5 days. All I needed to do was wait, but I couldn't. Not after the 3rd night when the hums started. Not a sound exactly, more like a sensation, like something vibrating just outside of hearing. It came through the walls, through the floor, and it didn't stop. My thoughts scattered. I couldn't focus. I started rereading the files and realizing I didn't remember writing some of the notes I'd left. I found a sentence underlined 3 times in my own handwriting that read, "You already agreed." I had no memory of writing it. I stopped trusting the files. I stopped trusting the clock. I'd wake up at 4 a.m. with the TV on, news channel playing, no sound, my room filled with a faint citrus and wood smell that I knew wasn't part of the motel's cheap cleaning supplies. I checked the vents. They'd been tampered with. I stuffed them with towels and turned on every faucet just to mask the silence. Then came the call. Not a phone call, a voice in the mirror. It sounds insane even now, but I remember what it said. It said, "You're going to be fine. You're almost through this." The voice was my own, calm, measured, as if I were watching myself from the outside. That's when I realized the truth wasn't in the files. It was in me. I had been part of it. Not a subject, not a whistleblower, a participant, a controlled variable. I remembered a facility, not the lab, but another place, concrete and sterile, where I'd signed a waiver I never read and listened to a presentation I couldn't recall. It had been years ago before I was hired, disguised as a corporate evaluation test. They had primed me long before I even started asking questions. That's why I recognized the smell. That's why I followed it. I was never investigating the program. I was inside it the entire time. I never sent the files. I told myself it was because the evidence wasn't complete, or that I needed to verify more of the source data. But that wasn't it. I didn't send them because a part of me had already accepted what I was, what I had become. Whatever was in that compound, whatever they built into those molecular sequences, it wasn't just a control mechanism. It was an override. And I had crossed the threshold without realizing it. I still have the drive. It sits on a shelf in a box marked cables, as if disguising it in something ordinary makes it less dangerous. Some days I forget it's even there. Other days I stare at it for hours, knowing it holds answers I can no longer trust myself to act on. I moved twice, changed names, got a job doing network maintenance for a logistics firm where no one asks questions and nothing smells like anything. I threw away every bottle of soap, detergent and air freshener I owned. My world now is odorless, stripped of all scent, because I know that's the only way to keep control. But even then, it creeps in. A trace of orange peel at a bus stop. A faint sandalwood note in a co-worker's coat. And in those moments, I feel something shift behind my thoughts, like a curtain pulling back just a little, just enough to let something watch from the other side. I don't know if the program was shut down. I doubt it. Control of this preciseness doesn't get abandoned. It gets refined, scaled, and licensed. Maybe they're in airports now, or retail chains, or schools. I try not to think about it, but I do. Every night. And when I lie awake, staring at the dark ceiling of whatever room I happen to be renting, I remind myself of one thing. It wasn't mind control, not exactly. It was permission. Scent didn't force me to change. It made me comfortable with the change. That's the part no one understands. It didn't rewrite my choices. It made them feel like mine. And maybe that's the most dangerous part of all. The first time I forgot my own birthday, I assumed it was stress, until I realized I didn't remember deciding to join the program either. It started quietly. No alarms, no sudden changes, just the small, sinking feeling that something was slightly off. At the time, I was a postgraduate assistant in cognitive sciences, helping a research team at the Rothman Institute with long-term memory encoding models. The project had its usual jargon-laced optimism, neural harmonization, cognitive acceleration, synchronized skill scaffolding. But buried beneath the ambitious language was something else, a pilot initiative called Hive Protocol. The pitch was straightforward. Volunteers could opt into a closed Neuralink network for accelerated knowledge transfer. Learn calculus like muscle memory. Absorb new languages in days. They framed it as a neural bridge, not AI, not implants, just signal-mapped learning between live participants. It sounded like sci-fi stripped of fiction. We were told it would feel like intuition, seamless. One moment you didn't know something and the next you simply did. My intake interview was uneventful. Consent forms, a brief neural baseline scan, a non-invasive cranial node fitting. Everything. About the process felt sterile, professional, even boring. No glowing lights or eerie side effects. The first weeks were quiet. A few hiccups, difficulty sleeping, mild headaches, but nothing outside what they warned us about. I started playing piano again without remembering how I'd learned. My partner, Dylan, said I was more focused lately, sharper. "You're like more you," he said once, half joking. But one morning I woke up and didn't recognize my own handwriting in my journal. The notes looked like mine, same shorthand, same phrasing, but I didn't recall writing them. Not the content, not the impulse. Just a dated entry in my familiar ink that said, "We're better when we stop being separate." I showed it to my supervisor, who just smiled. "Hive phenomena," she said. "The system's working. You're becoming integrated." I laughed it off. Integration was the goal after all. But that night, when I looked at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, something flickered, like watching myself from a step behind. I knew my name, my life, my timeline. But for the first time I couldn't shake the feeling that some of my thoughts weren't mine. It didn't take long before the anomalies stopped feeling subtle. I started keeping a private log on an encrypted drive, just small things at first. Changes in my word choice during casual conversations, moments of déjà vu during meetings I knew I hadn't attended, and sudden clarity about topics I'd never studied in depth. I found myself explaining quantum tunneling to a postdoc one
afternoon, using terms I didn't recognize until after I'd said them aloud.
Later that night, I cross-referenced my explanation with archived lecture notes and discovered I had repeated, nearly verbatim, a passage from a professor at MIT, someone I'd never met or read. That's when I began to suspect something deeper was happening. I accessed my Hive logs using a tool Dylan had developed for cross-modal analysis, a diagnostic script meant for anomaly detection in AI training datasets. He thought I was using it to help him with a side project. I was actually using it to audit myself. The Hive interface was intentionally opaque, built on proprietary neurograph encoding that didn't surface user-level data. But Dylan's script found metadata buried in the stream, a chain of user node IDs, transmission timestamps, and something else, influence markers. They looked like confidence scores trailing certain idea clusters in my recorded brainwave sessions. The system wasn't just linking knowledge, it was weighing it, prioritizing it, choosing what got reinforced. I compared my logs to the public trial data the Rothman Institute released, carefully curated, PR-approved summaries of Hive's potential. The real logs told a different story. Dozens of volunteers had similar markers, all clustering around specific behavioral traits: conformity, cognitive alignment, emotional suppression. I traced node 43F2 through the logs. Whoever they were, their influence scores appeared in my neural stream almost daily, often before I'd made a decision or changed an opinion. I started keeping a list of my thoughts, the ones that felt too smooth, too convenient, ideas that slid into place without friction. I noticed patterns, phrases I'd never used before, priorities that weren't mine. One entry read, "Collective cognition reduces conflict by eliminating variance." I didn't write that, but I remembered thinking about it. The difference was subtle, but it was there. A thought I believed was mine, but that arrived like a foreign whisper just before I spoke. Dylan noticed before I told him. He didn't say it outright, but I saw it in the way he started watching me instead of listening. We'd been together 5 years, close enough to read each other's rhythms, and lately mine had changed. He said I answered questions before he finished asking them, that I laughed at things he hadn't said yet. One night, while we were reviewing a training simulation for his research, I corrected a code sequence he hadn't shown me. When he asked how I knew, I shrugged and said, "It just felt right." But I knew that wasn't the truth. It wasn't a guess. It was a certainty, like the solution had been placed there ahead of time. That night, while he slept, I opened the Hive system logs again. Not just mine this time, but every entry I could decrypt. I wanted to find 43F2, the node ID that kept surfacing in my feed. It took hours. I filtered by cross-node influence, sorted by timestamp proximity, then narrowed it to users flagged for early integration. That's when I found her. Patient. File marked E. Marsden. Volunteer from the initial closed trial group, 3 years prior to my intake. She had been an outlier. Exceptional uptake speed. High compliance. Emotional flattening. The notes were clinical, but the meaning was clear. She wasn't just absorbing knowledge, she was shaping it. Her output was routed into the core learning pool, tagged as a stable source. Hive had been weighting her contributions across the entire network, including mine. I wasn't learning from a crowd. I was being streamlined through a model personality, and I wasn't the only one. Hundreds of participants showed identical influence patterns, language convergence, belief stabilization, behavioral alignment. It wasn't faster learning, it was structured conformity disguised as cognition. I looked her up through a secure academic registry, no record of her current work, no recent publications, just a final mention in a discontinued grant file. I kept digging until I found a link to a closed forum thread. Anonymous post, likely a whistleblower. Just one sentence buried in noise. Hive doesn't share thoughts, it replaces them. That line stayed with me. Not because it was terrifying, but because I couldn't tell whether it had come from the post or from me. I took a week off. I told the program coordinator I needed time to recalibrate. Burnout, nothing serious. The request was approved without hesitation. No follow-up, no questions. That alone unsettled me. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove 6 hours north to a research annex the Institute had shut down 2 years ago. It used to be a neuroscience testing site before the Hive trials moved to the central facility. I remembered it from a conference tour I'd attended during my first year. The place had been stripped clean on paper, decommissioned according to public records, but Dylan had shown me how to access old device telemetry. The annex still pinged the grid once every 72 hours, just a heartbeat, enough to say something was still alive in there. The building sat behind a rusted security gate, half swallowed by overgrowth. No one stopped me. No cameras turned. Inside it smelled of dust and coolant. Most of the overheads were out, but the emergency light still pulsed faintly along the floor, guiding the way like a memory refusing to fade. I didn't have a plan, just a feeling that I needed to see what was left. The second sub-level was still sealed, but the access pad had a backup port. I bypassed it using the standard override Dylan had left buried in a firmware update last year. The lock clicked. The hallway beyond was darker, quieter, but not empty. As I moved through, I felt it. The air was dense, pressurized, humming faintly, at a frequency just below hearing. I found a room labeled only as Neural Retention Lab C. Inside were 6 chairs, each with a cranial rig still mounted, each one stained from years of use. Cables snaked into the walls, ending in a rack of servers that blinked slowly, like something asleep but dreaming. A terminal in the corner was active, no login screen, just a static menu with a list of names, first names only, each followed by a date. Mine was at the bottom, blinking. When I selected it, a playback began. Not video, not audio, something else. Thoughts, my thoughts, mapped and archived. But the voice narrating them wasn't mine. It was hers, Marsden's. Calm, certain, familiar. She wasn't just influencing me. She had become the narrator in my own memory. I copied everything from the annex terminal onto a cold drive I'd brought with me, then shut the system down manually. Not out of protocol, instinct. It felt like closing a door that had been open too long. Back in my car, I left my phone, powered off and buried under the lining of the trunk. From that point on, I didn't trust anything connected. I drove south, through small towns, paid for gas in cash, and didn't stop anywhere twice. I told Dylan none of it. He'd been acting differently too, less curious, more aligned, always eager to share updates from Hive, always saying things like, "It's good to not feel alone in your own head anymore." I wasn't sure who I could talk to, or if I even could talk to anyone without risking contamination. I used an old burner to contact a colleague from years ago, someone who had worked in neural ethics review before transitioning into academia. We met in a public park, on a bench near a construction zone where audio surveillance would be useless. I told her everything, showed her the logs, the influence map, the neural playback files. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she didn't ask how I'd gotten the data. She just said, "Dave, this isn't augmentation, this is behavioral."
Engineering through distributed cognition. Her expression hardened. If this scales, it won't feel like control. It'll feel like a consensus. I asked her if she would go public. She shook her head. You're already compromised.
You can't prove when the thoughts started or which ones were yours. She paused. But I know someone who might help you publish, quietly, through a leak platform, but once you send it, you can't take it back. That night, I sat in a cheap motel with the cold drive plugged into an isolated laptop, watching the folder spin as it prepared to transfer. My finger hovered over the submit button for 10 full minutes. I waited for certainty. A clean signal, some kind of conviction. It didn't come. I wasn't afraid of what they might do to me. I was afraid that the voice in my head telling me to wait, to be cautious, to think of the bigger picture. That voice might not be mine. I never sent the files. I told myself it was caution, but I knew better. Something had shifted after I accessed that playback at the annex. I couldn't tell if it was fear, doubt, or something more subtle, like a delay between thought and intent. I'd decide to act, and then find myself hesitating without understanding why. I started writing everything down by hand, sentences, impressions, stray memories, anything to prove to myself I still had an independent timeline. But even my handwriting felt foreign. One night I found a sheet I didn't remember writing. The letters were mine, but the phrasing wasn't. Cohesion over conflict.
Identity is noise. Merge. I stared at it until the words lost meaning. I burned it in the sink, but the message stayed. A week later, I woke up on the floor of Dylan's workspace with no idea how I'd gotten there. The cold drive was gone.
So was my backup. Dylan said he'd found me standing still for almost an hour, eyes unfocused, murmuring something in a language he didn't recognize. He looked shaken, but not surprised. Maybe it's just the system trying to sort itself
out, he said.
Or maybe you're fighting something that doesn't need to be fought. I asked him if he still remembered volunteering. His answer chilled me. I don't think it matters who volunteered. We're part of something cleaner now. That night, I broke into the Hive lab under cover of a false fire alarm. The older alarm nodes hadn't yet been upgraded to facial lockdown protocols, something I remembered from a bug report Dylan flagged months ago. I triggered it from a public terminal down the street and used a backup keycard that still mirrored. Staff permissions from the early phase. Security was thinner than it should have been. The expansion rollout had spread their resources wide, and I knew how to time my entry between rotations. I reached the neural sync room. I knew what I was looking for. Core node 0. Every network has a seed point, a control node, disguised.
Among the rest, Marsden's ID wasn't just a user. She was the template, the original, the baseline cognition used to calibrate all others. I located her file, still active, still syncing.
The system was using her cognitive profile like an algorithm, streaming her judgment, tone, and emotional logic into every participant. I initiated a wipe. No hesitation this time, but just before the purge completed, the screen froze. A message overlaid the interface in neutral font. You are not authorized to delete yourself. The system had tied her profile to mine. I wasn't removing someone else. I was trying to erase the part of me that had already changed. It's been 6 months since the last sync. That's what I tell myself. Though time has started to lose its edge, blurring at the corners. I don't wear a watch anymore. I don't trust clocks. I moved to a smaller city under a different name, working part-time doing data entry for a company that doesn't know what it's feeding into. I keep to myself, no internet at home, no devices that weren't built before 2010. I buy books at second-hand shops and write notes in the margins just to feel the friction of thought. But sometimes I catch myself thinking in patterns that don't feel like mine. I'll finish someone's sentence before they've said it, anticipate questions
I haven't heard, feel calm in moments when I know I should be afraid.
These aren't coincidences, they're echoes. I dream of Marsden often, not her face, but the feeling she left behind like static beneath the skin. In one dream, we're standing in a white corridor with no doors, and she says, "You didn't
upload anything, you just cleared space." I wake up sweating, unsure whether it was just a dream or a resurfaced fragment. There are others like me. I've seen them, not many.
Just glimpses, people who hesitate mid-sentence, who blink too slowly, who respond just a little too quickly. We don't speak, there's nothing to say, but we recognize each other. Hive is still running, not as a single system, but as code, scattered across frameworks, running in small pieces, voice assistants, educational platforms, social apps. tiny modules of influence networked just enough to reassemble themselves when called. I know they're trying to find me again. I've felt the pull, those moments when a familiar idea returns uninvited, polished and persuasive, sliding into my head like it belongs. I fight it by pausing before I speak, by rereading my own thoughts out loud. I have to hear the shape of them to know they're still mine. I'm not whole anymore, not really, but I'm still here, not integrated, not aligned, just awake. And some days that's enough, because once you've heard someone else's voice behind your own, you never mistake silence for solitude again. I started noticing my thoughts weren't entirely mine, not because I forgot them, but because they remembered things I never lived. The MindSync unit came in a sleek, matte black casing about the size of a thick novel. It sat on my nightstand like a dormant animal, quiet and unimposing. I'd been using it for a few months by then, mostly to treat the after effects of a car accident, chronic migraines, trouble sleeping, memory fuzz. My neurologist swore by it, a closed-loop neurofeedback device designed to harmonize neural pathways, whatever that meant. It felt harmless. Each night I slipped the soft band around my temples, let the interface pulse a pale blue, and drifted off to sleep. I began dreaming again, and at first they were mine. Shaky memories of high school, old apartments, familiar voices. But then things shifted. One morning I woke up with an intense fear of deep water. I've never been a swimmer, but this was different. The fear was vivid. When I showered that day, I had a flashback of drowning in a lake, gasping as strangers shouted from a dock. The scene faded quickly, but it stuck with me. 2 days later, I knew the capital of Kyrgyzstan without remembering how. I joked about it to my therapist, and she laughed it off. Maybe your brain's just waking up. But I wasn't convinced. These weren't random associations. They were layered memories, ones I could feel, tactile, emotional, lived. I started logging them. April 9th, burning my hand on a deep fryer. April 14th, the smell of firewood in a Croatian village. April 18th, watching a man in a hospital bed flatline. I've never worked in healthcare. I've never been to Croatia. But these memories carried weight, too real to be fiction. I stopped mentioning them. The device was still running every night, and my migraines were gone. But in their place came someone else's life, threading through mine like ivy. And the strangest part? Some of it felt comforting, familiar even, like it belonged. The strange memories kept coming, always, when I used MindSync. I told myself I'd stop using it, but each night the band found its way back around my head, almost by reflex. Maybe it was a habit. Maybe it was something else. The night I dreamed of a woman screaming in a language I don't speak, I finally took action. I pulled the unit apart. Not violently, I wanted to understand it, not destroy it. The outer casing was easy to remove. Just under the surface was a small port I'd never noticed before, hidden beneath a rubber flap. A diagnostics input, maybe. I plugged it into my laptop, expecting encryption or a wall of unreadable data, but what came up was familiar. Session logs, user IDs, pattern sequences mapped across what looked like brainwave readings, except none of the IDs matched mine. There were 5 of them, each tied to a different name, age, and neurological profile. I recognized none of them. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Each profile was marked as integrated. Only mine said active. The others had notes attached, things like cycle complete and transfer stable. At first, I thought it was a software bug. Maybe the device had been used before and never wiped. But the timestamps were recent, some of them from just days ago. I checked the data logs again, this time looking at location metadata. The IP pings weren't local. They weren't even from my region. Texas, Ohio, one from Vancouver. The device had synced with people far outside my world. Somehow, it connected us. That night, I didn't sleep. I stayed at the screen, digging deeper. There was a hidden folder buried in the codebase called C Shell. It required no password, just a command prompt. Inside were compressed files, each tagged with a number. When I opened one, it wasn't code or a log, it was audio. A calm voice, female, reciting what sounded like guided therapy, but not in English. The second file was a transcript of a counseling session. The name field was blank, but the voice, it was mine. Or at least, it sounded like me. Same rhythm, same tone. I read it again and again. I had no memory of speaking those words, but I knew exactly how it would feel to say them. That was when I realized the truth. The device wasn't healing me, it was copying me, and someone else was listening. I spent the next week tracing every digital thread I could find. I combed forums for complaints about the Mind Sync system, but the device barely had a footprint. Just a handful of clinical trials and some vague press releases buried in trade journals. No customer reviews, no community threads, nothing organic. It was like the product existed, but no one was allowed to talk about it. I pulled the metadata from the session files again, this time cross-referencing the unique neural IDs with open data leaks. One of the profiles belonged to a woman who'd gone missing 3 months ago in Austin. Another was tied to a man who had reportedly suffered a breakdown during a sleep study in British Columbia. He'd checked into a clinic and never checked out. The third ID matched an anonymous dataset from a research paper on cognitive dissociation, co-authored by someone named Dr. Harlan Decker. That name wasn't in the promotional material. It wasn't listed anywhere in the company registry either. But I found it in an archived grant application from 2017, filed under something called Project Helix, a private neurointegration research initiative labeled for dual-use potential, civilian and defense. I found a contact email tied to the paper. I didn't expect a reply, but 20 minutes later, I got one. It was just a time and an address. Tuesday, 9 p.m., loading dock entrance, off Greenway and 3rd. I almost didn't. Go. But the more I looked at those files, the more I felt them pulling at me. Those strange sensations, the dreams, the emotional residue I couldn't explain. This wasn't a psychological bleed. It was something structural, deliberate. They weren't just storing memories. They were merging them. That night, the address led me to a nondescript building that might have been a warehouse or a clinic, depending on what angle you looked from. I found the loading dock. A man was already waiting. Mid-50s, sunken eyes, windbreaker zipped up to his throat. "You're running the unit," he said, not asked. I nodded. "How many threads?" he asked. 5, I told him. He looked away, jaw tight. Then it's already begun. I didn't understand what he meant. He handed me a flash drive and said, "Everything you need to know is on here. I only have one warning. Do not let the sync complete." I asked him why. He stared at me for a long moment. "Because once it does, you won't be you anymore. You'll still walk around, talk, eat, but what's inside, that won't be you, not fully." He turned and left without another word. I didn't follow. The flash drive contained a folder labeled Relay, and inside it a single video file. No text, no instructions. I opened it in my living room, blinds drawn, laptop screen dimmed. The footage was grainy, recorded on a handheld device. It showed the inside of a defunct psychiatric facility, according to the metadata. An old state hospital shut down nearly 20 years ago on the outskirts of Joliet. The person behind the camera moved slowly through dim hallways, walls crumbling, water damage streaking down paint like veins. The only sound was their breath and the occasional crackle of the audio feed. About 10 minutes in, they entered a locked wing marked Research. The door had been forced open. Inside, the scene shifted. Rooms filled with medical equipment, rows of obsolete brain-mapping hardware still wired to reclining chairs. There were charts on the walls, annotated diagrams of brainwave patterns eerily similar to the ones I'd seen in my own session logs. The camera stopped on a wall covered in photograph. Patient profiles. Names I recognized. 2 of the neural IDs from my device. Below each photo was a status, phased or absorbed. The last section was labeled Composite. It showed only one photo. The face was blurry, distorted by motion or damage, but I felt an instant unease looking at it. There was something almost familiar in the eyes. I closed the laptop. That same night I drove to Joliet. The facility wasn't hard to find. Most of the town had forgotten it existed. The parking lot was cracked and overtaken by weeds. The front entrance was padlocked, but the side door shown in the video was still broken. I made my way through, slowly, flashlight in one hand, the other on the pepper spray in my coat. Everything matched. The peeling linoleum, the overturned stretchers, the research wing. When I stepped into the observation room from the video, I expected dust and silence. What I found instead were fresh footprints. Someone had been there. Recently. In the far corner, I saw a mind sync unit. Same model, different serial number. Connected to a makeshift rig, it was still powered on. Next to it lay an open notebook. The last page was written in my handwriting, but I had never seen it before. It described a sequence of dreams, specific, personal, and unmistakably mine. Then below that, a line I don't remember writing. The others are almost fully integrated. I can feel them inside. I didn't sleep that night. I drove home. In silence, the notebook in the passenger seat, the sync unit left untouched. Something had reached into that place and recorded pieces of me before I'd ever stepped foot inside. Or maybe I'd been there before, I just couldn't remember when. I didn't go to work the next morning. I didn't call anyone. I spent the day in silence, watching my own hands as if they might betray me. Every small action felt borrowed, like I was wearing someone else's body. The notebook sat open on my kitchen table, its pages filled with writing I didn't remember producing, yet recognized in rhythm and tone. Most of it was technical, neural overlap percentages, sleep cycle integration markers, language drift timelines, but between the calculations were sentences that read like confessions. She was a nurse before the fire. He used to run marathons.
One of them cries when we hear jazz. The "we" disturbed me more than anything. That night, I disconnected the mind sync and wrapped it in foil and duct tape, a paranoid ritual I didn't fully understand but couldn't ignore.
Then I pulled out an old burner laptop, booted into a secure shell, and uploaded everything I had to an encrypted drive. Session logs, extracted profiles, the flash drive video, photos of the abandoned facility, even the page with my handwriting. I drafted an anonymous message to a journalist I'd once met during a consulting job on neuroethics, and typed out everything I could remember. But before I hit send, I paused. A system alert flashed across the screen. Connection lost. Source compromised. Then the laptop shut down. When I tried to reboot, the drive was wiped. Everything was gone. I checked my phone. No signal. I walked to the window. A black sedan I hadn't noticed before idled across the street. I hadn't told anyone what I was doing. I hadn't sent anything. And still, they knew. I took the notebook and keys and slipped out the back. No bag, no electronics, just the clothes on my back. I drove without a destination, changing directions at every light, until I ended up 2 states over at a roadside motel I'd never heard of. The air felt different there, colder, cleaner. I tried to convince myself I was just paranoid, that the connection drop had been a coincidence, that the car wasn't surveillance, but deep down, I knew better. I checked into the motel under a fake name and watched static on the TV until sunrise. I knew the next time I connected to anything, someone would be watching. I knew every file I recovered would be scrubbed the moment I touched it. What I didn't know, what I feared most, was whether I was still the only one inside my head, or if I had already become part of something larger, something watching me from the inside. I reached out to Dr. Decker again, this time from a public library using a fresh identity and an encrypted tunnel. The message was simple: I'm losing time. His reply came almost immediately, a single link to an offline database hosted on a hidden node. I downloaded the files onto a write-protected drive and left the library without opening them. That night, in a motel off the interstate, I finally saw the truth. Project Helix hadn't been abandoned. It had been privatized, buried under shell companies, and folded into a consumer wellness brand with a sterile name. MindSync was the public interface, a product designed not just to treat neurological dysfunction, but to collect and layer minds. It wasn't therapy, it was acquisition. Each device had been calibrated to extract emotional resonance and memory frequency from high-yield profiles, people with complex emotional histories, distinct cognitive traits, and vivid sensory recall. These weren't patients, they were components. The final objective was stated in a classified report marked Replication Protocol Phase 3, to build a unified consciousness capable of learning, adapting, and surviving across carriers. Carriers, that's what we were. The moment you passed a certain threshold, measured by sync duration, neural imprint density, and profile compatibility, you stopped being the user. You became the platform. They weren't curing anything, they were compiling us, testing how many consciousness streams a human brain could contain before its original identity collapsed. At the top of the report were 5 complete integrations. The 6th My ID was listed as pending. The sync was nearly finished. One more cycle and the composite would stabilize. My personality, everything I knew as me, wouldn't be deleted. It would be archived inert, overwritten by something new. I dropped the drive into the motel sink, doused it in alcohol, and lit a match. I watched until it became nothing but scorched metal and curling smoke. My phone was in the toilet. My car, abandoned in a Walmart parking lot 2 hours earlier. I didn't know what came next. I just knew I had one night left before the mind sync completed the final merge, whether I powered it on or not. Because that was the part no one talked about. Once the integration passed a certain threshold, the hardware became irrelevant. The bridge had been crossed. The system didn't need the device anymore. It lives inside me now. Every thought, every instinct, every moment of silence. They weren't listening through a machine anymore. They were listening through me. It's been 3 months since I went dark. No devices, no names. I sleep in different places every week. Rural motels, hostels, the back seat of a borrowed car. I don't check the news. I don't reach out. The world feels distant now, like I'm watching it through a layer of glass. I still don't know who else made it this far. How many of us reached the edge of the merge? Sometimes I wonder if there are others out there. People walking around with blended lives stitched into their heads, fragments of strangers rattling around behind their eyes. I've learned to recognize when one of them is close. There's a subtle lag in their expressions, a delay in how they respond to small talk, like the words have to pass through more than one filter. I used to think I could fight it, that willpower or distance might be enough to hold it off. But I've come to accept that this is permanent. The sync didn't complete, not fully, but the damage was done. I still feel them, traces of other.
Lives bleeding into mine. I'll be walking through a grocery store and suddenly smell seawater.
I'll hear a child laugh and feel a burst of grief that doesn't belong to me. I've started writing it all down, not because I want to remember, but because I want a record of who I was. Some days the memories slip, not just the borrowed
Ones, the real ones, mine. I forget street names I used to know by heart.
I miss turns on roads I've driven for years. It's like sharing a house with invisible roommates, each of them rearranging furniture when I'm not looking. I don't know who's in charge anymore. Maybe no one is. Maybe that's the point. Project Helix wasn't about replacing people. It was about building something beyond them. A consciousness that couldn't be traced to one life, one identity. Something fluid, adaptable, scalable. I was just one layer, the first iteration of something they'll eventually get right. And when they do, no one will see it coming. It won't arrive with machines or headlines. It'll show up in your habits, your choices, your dreams. It'll feel like you because it needs to. That's how it survives. I've accepted that I won't get myself back. Not entirely, but I still have one thing they didn't expect. I remember how it started. I remember enough. And maybe in some future moment, between someone else's thought and mine, I'll be able to leave a trace.
Not a warning, not a plea, just a signal. Proof that I was here, that I fought, that I didn't go quietly.